In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, few names inspire as much dread across the galaxy as Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka. Yet before he became the greatest Ork warlord of his age, Ghazghkull was merely one of countless Ork boys fighting among the brutal Goth clan on the world of Urk, a planet as harsh and unforgiving as the greenskins who called it home. The industrial world of Urk existed in a perpetual state of tribal warfare, with Ork clans battling for supremacy across its polluted wastelands and scrap cities. Among these warriors, the Goth clan stood as one of the most numerous and aggressive, valuing close combat and brute strength above all else. Their black and white checkered patterns and crude armor marked them as traditional fighters even by Ork standards. It was into this environment of constant violence that Ghazghkull was spawned from the fungal reproductive cycle of the Orks, emerging as just another boy destined to fight and die in the endless conflicts of his species. During one particularly brutal engagement against human defenders, Ghazghkull sustained what should have been a fatal injury. A bolter round tore through his thick skull, destroying a significant portion of his brain matter. Such wounds would kill most creatures, but Orks possess remarkable resilience and regenerative capabilities. Rather than dying, Ghazghkull was dragged to a pain boy, the Orkish equivalent of a surgeon, though one who practices medicine with all the finesse of a butcher. The pain boy, known as Mad Doc Grotznik, saw an opportunity for experimentation rather than a patient in need. With typical Orkish ingenuity, a mix of intuition, brutality, and surprising effectiveness, Grotznik replaced the damaged portion of Ghazghkull's brain with a crude metal plate. The procedure was performed without anesthesia, using tools better suited for vehicle maintenance than brain surgery, yet somehow the Ork survived. What nobody could have predicted was how this crude augmentation would forever change the course of Ork history. Shortly after recovering from the procedure, Ghazghkull began experiencing powerful visions. He claimed to communicate directly with Gork and Mork, the twin deities of Orkish culture. To understand the significance of this, one must comprehend the fundamental nature of Ork theology. Gork and Mork represent the dual aspects of Orkish ideal. Gork is brutally cunning, while Mork is cunningly brutal. This subtle distinction makes perfect sense to Orks while bewildering all other races. These gods embody everything the greenskins aspire to be: powerful, violent, and unstoppable. Ghazghkull's visions were vivid and commanding. He proclaimed that Gork and Mork had chosen him as their prophet, tasked with uniting all Orks in a great Waaagh that would sweep across the stars. A Waaagh is more than just a military campaign. It's a psychic phenomenon unique to the Ork race, a manifestation of their collective Gestalt psychic field that grows stronger as more Orks gather together, believing in the same goal and leader. The timing of Ghazghkull's religious awakening coincided with increasing pressure on Urk from human colonists and military forces. The Ork saw this as confirmation of his divine purpose. The enemies of the greenskins were gathering, and only through unity could they triumph. His early proclamations focused on this immediate threat, calling for the various Goth warbands to unite against the human interlopers. What separated Ghazghkull from countless other Ork warlords who had risen and fallen throughout history was his uncanny ability to manipulate and channel the Waaagh energy. All Orks generate this psychic field unconsciously, but Ghazghkull demonstrated an almost supernatural connection to it. Under his leadership, vehicles moved faster, weapons fired more reliably, and wounds healed more quickly. These phenomena, while partially explainable through the established understanding of Ork psychic potential, manifested with unprecedented intensity around Ghazghkull. Researchers from the Ordo Xenos have theorized that the metal plate in Ghazghkull's skull may function as a crude amplifier for his natural psychic abilities, focusing the ambient Waaagh energy generated by his followers back into a more coherent form. Others suggest that the brain damage itself somehow unlocked latent potential within Ghazghkull's mind. Whatever the cause, the effects were undeniable and terrifying. As his power and influence grew, so too did Ghazghkull's physical form. Orks continue growing throughout their lives, with the most successful becoming significantly larger and stronger than their brethren. Ghazghkull's growth accelerated dramatically following his religious awakening, his body responding to his newfound purpose and success in battle. Within a remarkably short period, he transformed from a standard Ork boy into a towering knob, and eventually into a massive warboss standing nearly 3 meters tall and weighing as much as a small vehicle. The devotion Ghazghkull inspired among his followers transcended the typical Orkish respect for strength. While Orks naturally follow the biggest and strongest among them, the followers of Ghazghkull displayed a fanatical loyalty rarely seen in greenskin society. His proclamations of divine guidance resonated with something primal in the Orkish psyche. When he spoke of the will of Gork and Mork, even the most skeptical knobs found themselves nodding in agreement, their doubts washed away by the conviction in his voice and the undeniable results of his leadership. Ghazghkull's theological innovations extended beyond simply claiming divine favor. He developed a complex eschatology centered around the concept of the Great Waaagh, a final galaxy-spanning conflict in which all Orks would unite to conquer or destroy everything in their path. This apocalyptic vision provided a framework for Orkish ambitions that extended beyond the immediate gratification of battle and into something resembling a long-term strategic goal. The prophet's interpretation of Gork and Morks showed surprising sophistication for an Ork. While maintaining the core values of violence and strength, Ghazghkull emphasized the importance of unity and purpose. He taught that the gods favored not just those who fought well, but those who fought together under proper leadership, specifically his leadership. This theological justification for centralized authority represented a significant evolution in Orkish social organization, which traditionally favored a more fragmented power structure based solely on individual strength. Ghazghkull conveyed these divine messages through direct proclamations to his followers, often during the heat of battle or in the aftermath of victory. Unlike human religious leaders who might retreat to contemplative isolation to commune with their deities, Ghazghkull received his visions while engaged in the activities most sacred to Orkish culture, fighting and conquering. This reinforced the authenticity of his prophetic status in the eyes of his followers, as the messages came precisely when Orks would expect their gods to be most attentive. The content of these visions typically focused on immediate tactical concerns or broader strategic directives. Ghazghkull might announce that Gork wanted them to attack a particular enemy stronghold, or that Mork had revealed the location of hidden human defenders. Whether these pronouncements reflected genuine psychic insight or merely Ghazghkull's intuitive understanding of warfare remains debatable, but the results spoke for themselves. Victories accumulated, and with each success, more Orks flocked to his banner. As his warband grew from dozens to hundreds to thousands, Ghazghkull introduced organizational innovations that would have been impossible without the religious authority he wielded. He established a crude hierarchy among his followers, with specialized roles beyond the traditional Orkish divisions. Certain Orks were designated as Hearers of Gork or Fists of Mork, tasked with specific responsibilities within the growing Waaagh. These titles carried religious significance that helped overcome the natural Orkish resistance to complex organization. The theological aspects of Ghazghkull's leadership were perhaps most evident in how he handled dissent. Traditional Orkish leadership disputes are resolved through direct physical confrontation. An aspiring leader challenges the current boss to combat, and the victor takes command. Ghazghkull, however, introduced a new dimension to these power struggles. Challenging him meant not just opposing a powerful warlord, but questioning the chosen prophet of Gork and Mork themselves. Several early challengers discovered the consequences of such blasphemy. Rather than immediately accepting direct challenges, Ghazghkull would sometimes declare that the challenger must first prove worthy of fighting the prophet by completing some nearly impossible task. These trials, purportedly demanded by Gork and Mork themselves, typically resulted in the challenger's death or humiliation. On the rare occasions when direct confrontation became necessary, Ghazghkull fought with such ferocity and strength that the outcomes served to reinforce his divine mandate. The relationship between Ghazghkull and Mad Doc Grotznik evolved in fascinating ways following the prophet's rise to power. The deranged Painba, responsible for the metal plate that had changed everything, claimed special status as the one who had fixed the great prophet's head. Ghazghkull tolerated this presumption to a degree unusual for an Ork of his stature, perhaps recognizing the symbolic importance of keeping his creator close. This dynamic added another layer to the growing mythological narrative surrounding Ghazghkull's ascension. As his power base on Urk solidified, Ghazghkull's visions became increasingly cosmic in scope. He began speaking of distant worlds waiting to be conquered, of enemies beyond the stars who would test the might of the Orks, and of a destiny that would carry the Greenskins to heights of glory unseen since the mythical days of the legendary beast who had nearly conquered Terra itself. These proclamations coincided with increasing pressure from Imperial forces, who recognized the emerging threat and sought to eliminate it before it could spread beyond Urk. The Imperial response only served to validate Ghazghkull's prophecies. Each human attack became evidence of the enemy's fear, each setback a test of faith from Gork and Mork, each victory proof of divine favor. The prophet incorporated these events into an evolving narrative that placed his Waaagh at the center of a cosmic struggle, with the very gods of the Orks taking personal interest in their success. The culmination of Ghazghkull's early prophetic career came when Imperial forces, recognizing the growing threat, launched a massive assault on Urk. As battle raged across the planet's surface, Ghazghkull received what he described as his most important vision yet. Urk was doomed, but the Waaagh must survive. Following this divine guidance, he led a massive exodus of his followers to the nearby world of Armageddon, abandoning Urk shortly before Exterminatus was declared and the planet destroyed. This miraculous escape further cemented Ghazghkull's status as the chosen prophet of Gork and Mork. He had foreseen the destruction of their homeworld and saved countless Orks from annihilation. The migration to Armageddon marked the transition from a localized uprising to a genuine threat to Imperial security across an entire sector, setting the stage for the infamous Armageddon conflicts that would define Imperial military history for decades to come. The transition from ordinary Nob to feared warlord happened with brutal efficiency, as was the Orkish way. Following his prophetic awakening, Ghazghkull's first challenge came not from external enemies, but from within the Goth clan hierarchy. Ghazghkull, a hulking Nob who had commanded Ghazghkull's warband, saw the rising influence of the self-proclaimed prophet as a direct threat to his authority. What followed was inevitable in Ork society, a direct challenge for leadership. The confrontation took place in the center of their encampment, surrounded by eager boys thirsting for violence. Ghazghkull stood nearly a head taller than Ghazghkull at this time, his body covered in crude metal plates and trophies from previous kills. He wielded a massive cleaver that had split the skulls of countless enemies. By all traditional measures of Orkish combat prowess, Ghazghkull should have emerged victorious. What the challenger failed to account for was the transformation occurring within Ghazghkull. The metal plate in his head seemed to channel his rage with unprecedented focus. When Ghazghkull charged forward with his cleaver raised high, Ghazghkull sidestepped with surprising agility and delivered a crushing blow to his opponent's knee. As Ghazghkull stumbled, Ghazghkull seized the opportunity, grasping the larger Ork's head between his massive hands and slowly, deliberately crushing the skull until brain matter oozed between his fingers. The brutality and calculated nature of the kill sent a clear message to all who witnessed it. This was not merely a stronger Ork taking command, this was something different. The warband immediately submitted to Ghazghkull's leadership, and news of the kill spread quickly through the Goth clan. Over the following months, Ghazghkull consolidated his position through a series of similar challenges. Each victory added to his growing legend, and with each triumph, his physical size increased noticeably. The Ork metabolism, responsive to success and dominance, accelerated his growth beyond the normal rate. Ghazghkull began implementing changes to his warband structure, introducing a level of organization unusual for Ork forces. One of his first innovations was the establishment of a core group of trusted lieutenants, each chosen for particular skills rather than simply for size or strength. Among these early followers was Ugrok Ironskull, an unusually patient Ork with a talent for ambush tactics. Ghazghkull appointed him as his first banner bearer, entrusting him with the crude standard that would come to symbolize the growing Waaagh. The banner, fashioned from the flayed skin of Ghazghkull stretched across a frame of scavenged metal, became a rallying point in battle and a symbol of Ghazghkull's authority. Another key lieutenant was Dregmek, a mechboy whose technical ingenuity exceeded even the considerable standards of his specialized role. Ghazghkull recognized the strategic value of Dreg-Mech's abilities and provided him with resources and protection that allowed the mechboy to focus on developing increasingly destructive weaponry. This partnership would prove crucial in the conflicts to come, as Dreg-Mech's inventions gave Ghazghkull's forces a technological edge over rival warbands. The third member of Ghazghkull's inner circle was Warlord the Planet Smasher, a weirdboy whose psychic abilities manifested in particularly violent ways. Unlike most Ork warlords who viewed weirdboys with a mixture of respect and suspicion, Ghazghkull actively cultivated Warlord's powers, encouraging the manifestation of psychic phenomena during battles. This approach was dangerous. Weirdboys could easily lose control of their abilities, resulting in catastrophic warp discharges, but Ghazghkull seemed able to exert a calming influence on Warlord, channeling the psychic energy to devastating effect. With his core leadership established, Ghazghkull turned his attention to the broader power structure of Urk. The planet was dominated by several major warbosses, each controlling significant territory and resources. The most powerful among them was Urgok Facekrumpa, an enormous orc who had ruled the largest scrap city on Urk for nearly 2 decades, an eternity in the typically short-lived power structures of Ork society. Rather than immediately challenging Urgok, Ghazghkull demonstrated an unusual level of strategic thinking. He first targeted Scarfang, a lesser warboss whose territory bordered Urgok's domain. Scarfang commanded a sizable force, but had antagonized neighboring warbands through constant raiding. Ghazghkull approached several of these aggrieved parties, forming temporary alliances that allowed him to overwhelm Scarfang's defenses from multiple directions simultaneously. The battle for Scarfang's stronghold revealed Ghazghkull's emerging tactical acumen. Rather than relying solely on the traditional Ork approach of frontal assault, he employed diversionary attacks to draw out defenders while his main force targeted weak points in the perimeter. When Scarfang emerged to personally lead the defense, Ghazghkull was waiting. Their duel was brief and decisive, ending with Ghazghkull hoisting his opponent's severed head as a trophy. With Scarfang's territory and forces absorbed into his growing Waaagh, Ghazghkull implemented a pattern that would become his signature approach to conquest. Rather than simply looting and moving on, he established a structured occupation, with mechboys immediately put to work improving weapons and vehicles, and captured resources distributed in ways that strengthened his overall force rather than being fought over by individual orcs. This methodical approach continued as Ghazghkull targeted one rival warboss after another. Each conquest followed a similar pattern. Strategic alliances were useful, coordinated attacks rather than chaotic assaults, and systematic integration of captured resources. Within a year, Ghazghkull had eliminated or subjugated half the major warbosses on Urk, his territory forming a contiguous empire that stretched across a significant portion of the planet's main continent. Throughout this period of expansion, Ghazghkull continued to experience visions from Gork and Mork, which he shared with his followers. These divine messages increasingly focused on the need for industrialization and preparation for a greater conflict to come. Following these directives, Ghazghkull ordered the construction of massive factories across his territory, overseen by gangs of enslaved grots and captured mechboys. The industrial transformation of Urk under Ghazghkull's rule was remarkable even by the standards of Ork society, which is capable of surprising technological achievements when properly motivated. Smoke-belching factories produced endless streams of crude but effective weaponry. Massive foundries melted down scavenged metal to forge armor plates and vehicle components. Assembly lines staffed by countless grots churned out ammunition at an unprecedented rate. This industrial revolution caught the attention of Urgok Facekrumpa, who recognized the growing threat to his dominance. Urgok's response was typical of Ork leadership. He gathered his forces for a massive attack intended to crush Ghazghkull's upstart empire before it could grow any stronger. Intelligence about these preparations reached Ghazghkull through networks of commandos he had established throughout Urk, giving him time to prepare a response. Rather than fortifying his positions and awaiting the attack, Ghazghkull made a decision that demonstrated his growing strategic sophistication. He ordered his forces to abandon their outer territories, creating the impression of weakness and retreat. Urgok, sensing an opportunity for an easy victory, pursued aggressively, leading his army into a carefully prepared trap. The Battle of Red Gorge, as it came to be known, represented a turning point in Ghazghkull's rise to power. As Urgok's forces advanced through the narrow canyon, hidden artillery positions opened fire from the ridges above, raining explosive shells down on the tightly packed Orks. Simultaneously, units of commandos emerged from concealed positions to attack the rear of Urgok's army, cutting off their retreat. Caught in this devastating crossfire, Urgok's forces suffered heavy casualties before they could even engage with Ghazghkull's main army. When Ghazghkull finally ordered the frontal assault, his troops faced an enemy already demoralized and disorganized. The battle quickly turned into a rout, with Urgok's once mighty army disintegrating into scattered bands of fleeing Orks. Urgok himself fought with the desperate fury of a cornered beast, cutting down dozens of attackers before Ghazghkull pushed through the melee to confront him directly. Their duel was witnessed by hundreds of Orks from both armies, becoming the stuff of legend in later tellings. Urgok's brute strength and decades of experience clashed with Ghazghkull's divinely inspired fury and tactical mind. The fight lasted nearly an hour, with both combatants suffering grievous wounds that would have killed lesser Orks. In the end, Ghazghkull prevailed by exploiting a momentary opening in Urgok's defense, driving a jagged blade through his opponent's throat with such force that it severed the spinal column. As Urgok's massive body collapsed, Ghazghkull stood over him, blood-soaked and triumphant, and proclaimed that Gork and Mork had delivered judgment on all who would oppose their chosen prophet. Following this decisive victory, the remaining warbosses on Urk quickly submitted to Ghazghkull's authority. Some offered allegiance freely, recognizing the futility of resistance. Others required demonstrations of force, but none mounted the kind of organized opposition that Urgok had attempted. Within months, Ghazghkull had achieved what no Ork before him had managed, the complete unification of Urk under a single warlord. With his dominance secured, Ghazghkull turned his full attention to preparations for the great Waaagh that Gork and Mork had prophesied. The entire industrial capacity of the planet was redirected toward military production. Massive shipyards were constructed to build the fleet that would carry the Waaagh to the stars. Training grounds were established where Orks could hone their fighting skills against captured enemies and each other. During this period, Ghazghkull's personal power continued to grow at an astonishing rate. His physical size increased until he towered over even the largest knobs in his army. Mad Doc Grotznik, seeing an opportunity to further his own mad scientific pursuits, approached Ghazghkull with proposals for additional augmentations. The result was a series of cybernetic enhancements that further increased Ghazghkull's already formidable combat capabilities. Most significant among these augmentations was the replacement of his left arm with a massive power claw capable of tearing through tank armor. This prosthetic became a symbol of Ghazghkull's might, as recognizable as the metal plate in his skull. Other enhancements included reinforced bone structures, subcutaneous armor plating, and stimulant injectors that could flood his system with combat drugs during battle. As the preparations for the Waaagh accelerated, Ghazghkull instituted a system of trials to identify the most capable fighters among his followers. These competitions, ostensibly designed to select warriors for elite units, served the additional purpose of culling weaker Orks from the Horde and preventing the kind of internal conflicts that might threaten his leadership. The winners received special recognition and equipment, creating a meritocratic element within the typically chaotic Ork social structure. The final phase of Ghazghkull's consolidation of power involved the subjugation of the various specialist groups within Ork society. The mechboys were already largely integrated into his industrial apparatus, but the speed freaks, with their love of fast vehicles and independent raiding, presented a potential challenge to centralized control. Ghazghkull addressed this by establishing dedicated speed freak battalions with specific roles in his military structure, channeling their anarchic energy towards strategic objectives. Similarly, the commandos, Orks with an unusual predilection for stealth and subterfuge, were organized into formal reconnaissance units. Under Ghazghkull's direction, these unconventional warriors developed increasingly sophisticated infiltration techniques, providing valuable intelligence about both internal dissent and external threats. By the time Imperial intelligence became aware of the unprecedented unification occurring on Urk, Ghazghkull had transformed the planet into a fortress world entirely dedicated to war production. Massive armies drilled in the wastelands, factories operated continuously, and shipyards launched crude but functional vessels into orbit. The psychic emanations from millions of Orks, united under a single leader, created disturbances in the warp that attracted the attention of Imperial psychers across the sector. The metal hulls of countless Ork vessels darkened the void as Ghazghkull's armada pushed through the warp toward Armageddon in 940, one of the 41st Millennium. This was not a random target, but a calculated choice that demonstrated Ghazghkull's growing strategic acumen. Armageddon, a vital industrial world in the Segmentum Solar, represented both a valuable prize and a symbolic target. Its massive manufactorums, strategic location, and substantial human population made it an ideal proving ground for the Prophet's growing Waaagh. The journey from Urk had not been without challenges. Warp travel was notoriously dangerous for all species, but particularly for Orks, whose crude technology and lack of trained navigators made their voyages especially unpredictable. Several ships were lost to warp storms or mechanical failures, while others emerged in entirely different systems. Yet the bulk of the fleet remained intact, guided by what Ghazghkull claimed were the direct interventions of Gork and Mork. The fleet that arrived in the Armageddon system was a testament to Orkish industry and Ghazghkull's organizational abilities. Massive rock ships, asteroids hollowed out and fitted with crude engines, formed the backbone of the invasion force, each containing thousands of warriors and their equipment. Alongside these behemoths flew hundreds of smaller vessels, from retrofitted Imperial hulks to purpose-built Ork warships bristling with oversized guns and makeshift armor. Imperial defenses detected the approaching armada too late to mount an effective response. The system's early warning network, designed to alert defenders to conventional threats, struggled to track the erratic movements of the Ork vessels as they dropped out of the warp at different points around the planet. By the time Planetary Governor Hermann von Straub fully comprehended the scale of the invasion, Ork landing craft were already breaching Armageddon's atmosphere. The initial landings focused on the equatorial continent of Armageddon Prime, with drop pods and crude landing craft hammering into the ash wastes and industrial zones. Ghazghkull had divided his forces into 3 primary assault groups, each targeting different strategic assets. The largest contingent, led by Ghazghkull himself, struck directly at Hive Hellsreach, one of the planet's major population centers. The second group targeted the sprawling Promethium refineries in the Hemlock region, while the third moved to secure landing zones for the heavier equipment still in orbit. The Armageddon Steel Legion, the planet's primary defensive force, was caught unprepared by both the scale and coordination of the Ork assault. Trained primarily for mechanized warfare across the planet's vast ash wastes, the Steel Legion excelled at mobile operations with Chimera transports and Leman Russ battle tanks. However, the sudden appearance of Ork forces within the Hive cities themselves negated much of this advantage, forcing the defenders into unfamiliar urban combat scenarios. Governor von Straub's response to the crisis proved catastrophically inadequate. Rather than consolidating his forces and establishing defensive perimeters around critical infrastructure, he ordered piecemeal counterattacks that were quickly overwhelmed by the Ork numbers. His insistence on personally directing military operations, despite his lack of tactical experience, further complicated the Imperial response. Within days, 3 major hives had fallen to the greenskin tide, and Ork forces controlled nearly 40% of Armageddon Prime's surface. Ghazghkull's tactical approach during these early stages revealed sophistication unusual for an Ork warlord. Rather than allowing his forces to disperse in pursuit of individual combat, he maintained tight control over his primary assault groups, focusing their efforts on specific objectives. When the Steel Legion attempted to establish a defensive line along the Diabolus River basin, Ghazghkull did not waste resources on frontal assaults. Instead, he deployed units of commandos to infiltrate the Imperial positions and sabotage their artillery emplacements, followed by mass Stormboy drops behind the defensive line. This combination of stealth, aerial insertion, and conventional force overwhelmed the Imperial defenders, forcing a disorganized retreat that cost the Steel Legion much of their heavy equipment. The psychological impact of these defeats was perhaps even more significant than the material losses. Imperial forces accustomed to thinking of Orks as tactically simplistic found themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy displaying unexpected strategic depth. As the situation deteriorated, a new figure emerged among the Imperial defenders who would come to define the resistance against Ghazghkull's horde. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick, assigned to the 252nd Cadian Regiment supporting the Steel Legion, took command of the defense of Hive Hades after its military governor was killed in an Ork artillery barrage. Yarrick's first action was to execute several officers who had been preparing to abandon their positions. Establishing a brutal but effective standard, retreat meant death, whether at the hands of the enemy or by Imperial bolt pistol. Under Yarrick's leadership, the defense of Hive Hades stiffened considerably. He reorganized the disparate Imperial units into a cohesive force, established clear fields of fire for heavy weapons teams, and implemented a system of mobile reserves that could respond quickly to breaches in the perimeter. When Ghazghkull's forces launched their first major assault against the Hive, they encountered resistance unlike anything they had faced previously on Armageddon. The battle for Hive Hades lasted 3 weeks, with Ork forces gradually gaining ground through sheer numerical advantage, but paying a terrible price for each meter. Yarrick personally led counterattacks at critical junctures, his imposing figure and distinctive peaked cap becoming a rallying point for Imperial defenders. Reports indicate that he killed dozens of Orks in hand-to-hand combat during this period, including a Nob champion in a duel that cemented his reputation among both humans and greenskins. Ghazghkull, monitoring the progress of the siege from his command post in the captured Hive Volcanus, recognized the threat that Yarrick represented. The Commissar's ability to inspire effective resistance could potentially undermine the momentum of the entire Waaagh. In response, Ghazghkull diverted additional forces to Hive Hades, including specialized units of meganobs in heavy armor and squadrons of looted Imperial tanks. This escalation culminated in Ghazghkull personally leading an assault on Hive Hades' main defensive wall. The confrontation between the Ork warlord and the Commissar was brief but consequential. Yarrick, despite his formidable combat skills, could not match the raw physical power of the massive Ork. In the struggle, Yarrick lost his left arm to Ghazghkull's power claw, though accounts differ on whether it was completely severed or merely crushed beyond repair. Despite this grievous injury, Yarrick managed to wound Ghazghkull with his power sword before being forced to retreat. The Commissar was evacuated from the front line, but refused extensive medical treatment, instead demanding that the Mechanicus Medicae fit him with a crude bionic replacement so he could return to battle. The resulting augmetic arm, featuring a built-in power claw modeled after the very weapon that had taken his original limb, would become as much a part of Yarrick's legend as his unbreakable will. While Yarrick recovered, Hive Hades finally fell to the Ork onslaught. The survivors retreated to Hive Tartarus, the last major Imperial stronghold on Armageddon Prime. With each victory, Ghazghkull's forces grew not just in number, but in effectiveness. The Waaagh energy generated by millions of Orks united under his leadership created a psychic field that enhanced their already considerable physical abilities and made their crude technology function with surprising reliability. The fall of Hive Hades marked the high point of Ghazghkull's conquest, but also the beginning of a shift in the conflict's dynamics. Distress calls from Armageddon had finally prompted a significant Imperial response. The first reinforcements to arrive were elements of the Space Wolves chapter, led by their great wolf, Logan Grimnar. The Space Marines made planetfall near Hive Tartarus, using their strike cruisers and Thunderhawk gunships to bypass Ork-controlled territory entirely. Grimnar's tactical assessment of the situation was swift and decisive. Rather than attempting to recapture lost territory immediately, he focused on stabilizing the defense of Hive Tartarus and establishing secure supply lines to Armageddon Secundus, the planet's secondary continent where Imperial forces still maintained control. The arrival of these elite warriors provided a crucial morale boost to the beleaguered defenders and forced Ghazghkull to reconsider his approach. The Ork warlord's response to the Space Wolves' intervention demonstrated both his tactical flexibility and his growing understanding of Imperial psychology. Rather than concentrating his forces for a decisive assault on Hive Tartarus, where the Space Marines' superior combat abilities would give them a significant advantage, Ghazghkull launched a series of raids against civilian targets across Armageddon Secundus. These attacks, while militarily insignificant, forced Grimnar to divert resources to protect population centers, preventing him from mounting a coordinated counteroffensive. This period of the conflict saw the development of the personal nemesis relationship between Ghazghkull and Yarrick. The Commissar, now sporting his distinctive power claw, and with an augmetic eye that replaced one lost in subsequent fighting, became obsessed with defeating the Ork warlord who had humiliated him. Yarrick studied Orkish behavior patterns and language, developing an understanding of greenskin psychology that allowed him to predict their movements with uncanny accuracy. Ghazghkull, for his part, developed a peculiar respect for the human who had wounded him and continued to frustrate his plans. In intercepted Ork Vox transmissions, he referred to Yarrick as Old Bale Eye, a name that acknowledged both the Commissar's augmetic eye and his status as a worthy opponent. This respect did not translate to mercy. Ghazghkull offered substantial rewards to any Ork who could bring him Yarrick's head, but it represented an unusual acknowledgement of a human's martial prowess. As additional Imperial reinforcements arrived, including elements of the Ultramarines and Blood Angels chapters, the strategic situation began to shift. Grimnar coordinated with Yarrick to develop a counteroffensive aimed at splitting the Ork forces and recapturing key infrastructure. The plan called for a series of simultaneous strikes against Ork supply lines, followed by a major armored thrust toward Hive Volcanus, where intelligence suggested Ghazghkull had established his headquarters. The execution of this plan revealed the limitations of Ghazghkull's control over his massive Waaagh. While the Ork warlord had demonstrated unusual tactical sophistication, the fundamental nature of Ork psychology worked against sustained strategic coordination. As pressure mounted on multiple fronts, individual warbosses began acting with increasing independence, prioritizing immediate combat opportunities over Ghazghkull's broader objectives. This fragmentation created vulnerabilities that the Imperial forces exploited effectively. Space Marine strike teams targeted Ork mechboys and their workshops, disrupting the production and maintenance of the heavier Ork war machines. Steel Legion mechanized columns punched through weakened sections of the Ork line, recapturing promethium refineries and power generation facilities. Yarrick personally led the assault on Hive Infernus, driving the greenskin occupiers out in 3 days of brutal room-to-room fighting. Ghazghkull recognized the deteriorating situation, but remained confident in the overall strength of his position. His forces still outnumbered the Imperial defenders significantly, and he controlled most of Armageddon Prime's industrial capacity. In a calculated gamble, he ordered his forces to withdraw from overextended positions and consolidate around the primary hives, converting them into formidable fortresses bristling with looted weapons and surrounded by minefields of crude but effective Ork explosives. This consolidation set the stage for what many Imperial strategists expected to be a prolonged war of attrition, a scenario that typically favored the Orks, with their faster reproduction rate and indifference to casualties. However, events beyond Armageddon would ultimately dictate a different outcome. The conflict had drawn the attention of the Inquisition, particularly the Ordo Malleus, who recognized signs of potential demonic activity in the planet's equatorial region. The sting of defeat hung heavy in the recycled air of Ghazghkull's command ship as it broke orbit from Armageddon. The massive Ork warlord stood before a viewport, his scarred green face reflected against the backdrop of stars, the metal plate in his skull catching the dim light of the bridge. The first war for Armageddon had not ended, as the prophet of Gork and Mork had foreseen. Imperial reinforcements, the unexpected resilience of the human defenders, and the emergence of a worthy adversary in Commissar Yarrick had forced Ghazghkull to make a tactical withdrawal, a concept alien to most Ork warlords, but one that the cunning prophet understood was sometimes necessary. Ghazghkull's decision to retreat from Armageddon came after the arrival of significant Imperial reinforcements and the intervention of the Inquisition. Rather than waste his forces in a grinding war of attrition against an increasingly well-supplied enemy, he ordered a fighting withdrawal. His more independent warbosses initially resisted this command, their Orkish nature demanding they fight to the last. Ghazghkull dealt with this resistance in typical fashion. Those who questioned his divine guidance found themselves on the receiving end of his power claw, their heads added to the growing collection, adorning his personal banner. The evacuation was anything but orderly by Imperial standards, yet showed remarkable coordination for an Ork force. Mechboys worked frantically to repair damaged vessels, while Stormboys and Commandos conducted rearguard actions to slow the Imperial advance. Ghazghkull personally oversaw the loading of the most valuable war assets, the largest guns, the most successful war machines, and the skilled mechboys who could build more. Everything that couldn't be transported was rigged with explosives in a final act of defiance against the Imperial reclamation efforts. As the Ork fleet scattered into the void, Ghazghkull directed his flagship toward the Golgotha sector, a region of space with sparse Imperial presence and numerous resource-rich worlds suitable for rebuilding his Waaagh. The journey provided time for something rare among Ork warlords: genuine reflection. Alone in his cavernous command chamber, surrounded by trophies and the crude technological apparatus that maintained his cybernetic enhancements, Ghazghkull analyzed the failures and successes of the Armageddon campaign. The first revelation came during a particularly violent warp transit. As the ship shuddered around him, Ghazghkull experienced a vision more vivid than any before. Gork and Mork appeared to him not as vague impressions, but as towering presences that filled his mind with clarity. They showed him that Armageddon had not been a defeat but a test, a forge in which his Waaagh would be tempered like a blade. The true conquest would come later, after he had learned the lessons this first campaign had to teach. Upon reaching Golgotha, Ghazghkull established a new headquarters on the largest moon of the system's gas giant. The environment was harsh, with toxic atmosphere and extreme temperature variations, but these conditions deterred potential Imperial scouts and provided a perfect testing ground for toughening his forces. The moon's extensive cave systems were quickly converted into workshops, barracks, and storage facilities for the growing arsenal of weapons being produced by the salvaged manufacturing equipment from Armageddon. Ghazghkull's first priority was consolidating his remaining forces. The retreat from Armageddon had scattered his Waaagh across several sectors, with many ships becoming lost in the warp or falling prey to Imperial patrols. He dispatched his most reliable commandos in small, fast vessels to locate these scattered elements and guide them to Golgotha. This process took nearly a year, but gradually the strength of his horde began to rebuild. During this period of regrouping, Ghazghkull instituted organizational changes that would fundamentally alter the structure of his Waaagh. Traditional Ork warbands operated with minimal hierarchy beyond the immediate authority of their warboss, but Ghazghkull recognized that this limited their strategic effectiveness. He established a council of warbosses, each responsible for specific aspects of the growing empire. Dregmek oversaw technological development, Wurzag managed the psychic elements, and Ugrok handled military training and discipline. This council met regularly in Ghazghkull's cavernous throne room, seated around a massive table fashioned from the hull plating of an Imperial cruiser. These meetings were often violent affairs, with disagreements settled through combat, but they created a framework for coordinated action previously unknown in Ork society. Ghazghkull dominated these gatherings not just through physical intimidation, but through the force of his vision, describing with unusual eloquence the future conquests that awaited those who followed his guidance. Perhaps the most significant innovation during this period was Ghazghkull's development of what he called the Great Plan. Unlike the typical Ork approach of gathering a Waaagh and immediately launching it at the nearest target, Ghazghkull outlined a multi-stage strategy for galactic conquest. The first phase involved building infrastructure and training specialized forces. The second would test these forces against isolated Imperial worlds, refining tactics and identifying effective leaders. Only in the third phase would the full might of the Waaagh be unleashed against major targets like Armageddon. This strategic thinking extended to technological development as well. Ghazghkull recognized that while Ork technology was robust and adaptable, it often lacked the precision and reliability of Imperial equipment. He directed Dregmech to establish what became known as the Mech School, where promising young mech boys could experiment with looted Imperial and Tau technology, incorporating useful elements into traditional Ork designs. The results of this technological cross-pollination were impressive. New variants of the standard Ork battle wagon emerged, featuring improved armor distribution and more reliable propulsion systems. Shutas received crude but effective targeting assistance devices that improved accuracy without sacrificing the satisfying heft and noise that Orks preferred. Most significantly, Dregmech's team developed enhanced teleporta technology that allowed for more precise deep strikes during planetary assaults. Ghazghkull himself underwent significant augmentation during this period. Mad Doc Grotznik, eager to experiment on his most prestigious patient, replaced much of the warlord's original biology with cybernetic enhancements. Ghazghkull's skeleton was reinforced with adamantium, his muscle tissue interwoven with synthetic fibers, and his nervous system supplemented with accelerated response circuits. These modifications pushed the boundaries of what even Ork physiology could tolerate, resulting in frequent pain and occasional system failures, but the overall effect was to transform Ghazghkull into something beyond even the mightiest natural Ork. The psychological dimension of Ghazghkull's Waaagh philosophy also evolved during the Golgotha consolidation. Traditional Ork leadership relied primarily on fear and displays of personal strength, but Ghazghkull developed more sophisticated methods of control. He instituted regular speak-in times where he would address gathered Orks, not just to issue orders, but to reinforce their shared purpose and divine mandate. These speeches, delivered from elevated platforms with Wurzeg amplifying his voice through psychic means, created a sense of unified identity previously unknown in Ork culture. The content of these addresses revealed Ghazghkull's growing understanding of Orkish psychology. He spoke not just of fighting and conquest, but of building something lasting, an empire that would make Gork and Mork proud, where Orks could fight worthy enemies forever without running out of foes or resources. This vision of perpetual, purposeful warfare resonated deeply with his followers, providing a framework for their natural aggression that extended beyond immediate gratification. Practical training accompanied this ideological development. Ghazghkull established combat arenas where Orks could hone their skills against each other and captured enemies. Unlike typical Orkish pit fights, these sessions included tactical objectives and team-based scenarios that taught coordination and discipline. The most successful participants received recognition and rewards, creating a meritocratic system that identified and promoted capable leaders regardless of their original clan or size. The rebuilding process accelerated as the first wave of new Orks matured from the spores shed during the initial settlement of Golgotha. These fresh troops, born directly into Ghazghkull's Waaagh rather than absorbed from existing warbands, displayed heightened receptivity to his organizational structures. Without the ingrained habits of traditional Orkish society, they adapted more readily to concepts like specialized roles and coordinated operations. By the third year of the Golgotha consolidation, Ghazghkull's forces had grown to nearly 60% of their pre-Armageddon strength, but with significantly improved equipment and training. Test raids against isolated mining colonies and frontier outposts demonstrated the effectiveness of the new tactical approaches, with Imperial defenders overwhelmed by combinations of stealth, speed, and concentrated firepower that defied conventional understanding of Ork warfare. These successes emboldened Ghazghkull to expand his operations. He dispatched subordinate warbosses to establish additional bases throughout the sector, creating a network of fortified worlds that could support larger-scale operations. Each of these outposts followed standardized designs developed on Golgotha, featuring layered defenses, integrated manufacturing facilities, and dedicated training grounds. This standardization allowed for efficient resource allocation and created a consistent operational environment across Ghazghkull's growing domain. The expansion brought new challenges, particularly in maintaining control over distant warbosses who naturally tended toward independence once beyond Ghazghkull's direct oversight. To address this, he implemented a system of rotating commanders, regularly recalling warbosses to Golgotha for guidance and sending others to replace them. This prevented any subordinate from establishing a permanent power base while ensuring fresh perspectives and maintaining direct loyalty to Ghazghkull himself. Communication across this expanding empire relied on a combination of crude Vox technology, messenger ships, and Waagh's psychic projections. The Weird Boy had grown in power alongside Ghazghkull, his abilities enhanced by the concentrated Waaagh energy of millions of Orks unified under a single leader. During particularly important operations, Waaagh could establish temporary psychic links between Ghazghkull and distant warbosses, allowing for real-time strategic adjustments previously impossible in Ork campaigns. Throughout this period of growth and consolidation, Ghazghkull maintained a particular focus on intelligence gathering. His experiences on Armageddon had taught him the value of information about enemy capabilities and movements. Commando units received specialized training in infiltration and observation, while captured Imperial communication equipment was repurposed to intercept astropathic transmissions. This intelligence network provided early warning of Imperial fleet movements and identified vulnerable targets for future raids. One of the most significant technological innovations to emerge from the Golgotha period was the development of enhanced boarding torpedoes. Traditional Ork boarding actions relied on crude rockets with minimal guidance systems, resulting in high attrition rates before combat even began. Dregmek's improved designs incorporated salvaged Imperial targeting cogitators and reinforced hulls capable of withstanding defensive fire. These weapons would prove decisive in subsequent void engagements, allowing Ork forces to neutralize Imperial vessels with minimal damage to valuable hardware. The psychological impact of Armageddon continued to influence Ghazghkull's strategic thinking. He developed a particular interest in Commissar Yarrick, collecting whatever information his agents could gather about the human who had thwarted his conquest. This interest went beyond mere revenge. Ghazghkull recognized in Yarrick a model of what made human resistance effective, studying his methods to identify weaknesses in Imperial command structures and morale systems. This analysis extended to Space Marine tactics as well. The intervention of the Adeptus Astartes had been a turning point in the Armageddon campaign, and Ghazghkull directed significant resources toward developing countermeasures. Specialized units of Marine Krumpas were equipped with heavy armor and power weapons specifically designed to combat Space Marine physiology. Training scenarios replicated known Astartes tactics, preparing Ork forces for the inevitable confrontations with these elite Imperial warriors. By the 5th year of the Golgotha consolidation, Ghazghkull's empire had expanded to encompass 12 major worlds and dozens of smaller outposts. The industrial output of these combined holdings surpassed even the peak production achieved on Urk, with standardized weapons and vehicles flowing from massive factories staffed by countless enslaved workers and overseen by increasingly specialized mechboys. The military force this infrastructure supported had grown to unprecedented size, with over 15 million combat-ready Orks organized into semi-standardized formations. The ash wastes of Armageddon had barely settled from the first conflict when Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka's return cast a shadow over the planet once more. In 997 of the 41st Millennium, almost 6 decades after his first invasion, the prophet of Gork and Mork descended upon the world with a force that dwarfed his previous Waaagh in both size and sophistication. The intervening years had transformed Ghazghkull from a formidable warlord into a strategic mastermind whose understanding of warfare had evolved beyond anything the Imperium expected from an Ork. Imperial intelligence had tracked increasing Ork activity in nearby sectors for months, but few suspected that these movements represented the coordinated positioning of invasion forces. Ghazghkull had learned from his previous defeat, implementing a deception strategy that masked his true target until the last possible moment. Scout vessels were dispatched to multiple systems, creating the impression of random raiding rather than concentrated preparation. Only when his armada was fully assembled did Ghazghkull activate the final phase of his assault plan. The invasion began not with a frontal assault, but with a series of precision strikes against Armageddon's orbital defense network. Specialized teams of commandos, transported in modified boarding torpedoes, infiltrated key defense platforms, and disabled their weapon systems before the main fleet arrived. These operations showed a level of coordination previously unthinkable for Ork forces, with multiple teams striking simultaneously across thousands of kilometers of space to create gaps in the defensive screen. As alarms blared across Imperial command centers, the main Ork fleet translated from the warp. The armada that emerged was a testament to Ghazghkull's organizational genius, hundreds of vessels arranged in actual attack formations rather than the haphazard groupings typical of Ork fleets. At the center of this formation was Ghazghkull's flagship, a massive space hulk that had been extensively modified with additional engines, weapons arrays, and launch bays. The vessel's silhouette, resembling a clenched fist with extended claws, was designed to inspire fear even before its weapons came into range. The orbital battle lasted just under 27 hours, with Imperial Navy elements fighting desperately to slow the Ork advance. Commodore Strathen's battle group inflicted significant casualties on the invaders, destroying dozens of smaller vessels and damaging several capital ships. However, the sheer volume of Ork firepower eventually overwhelmed the defenders. The final Imperial vessels withdrew toward neighboring systems to request reinforcements, leaving Armageddon's skies open to the invaders. Unlike his first invasion, Ghazghkull did not immediately commit his ground forces to a single target. Instead, he implemented a three-pronged assault strategy that divided Imperial defenders and prevented the concentration of resistance. The primary landing zones were strategically selected to cut communication lines between major population centers and isolate key industrial complexes. Hive Acheron in the north, the Hemlock processing facilities in the east, and the Tempestora manufacturing district in the west came under simultaneous attack, forcing Planetary Governor von Straub to split his already limited defense forces. The composition of these landing forces revealed Ghazghkull's sophisticated understanding of combined arms warfare. Each assault group included specialized units tailored to their specific objectives. The force targeting Hive Acheron was heavy with infantry and siege equipment, prepared for urban combat. The Hemlock attackers included significant numbers of speed freaks and light vehicles, ideal for the open terrain surrounding the processing plants. The Tempestora force featured a high concentration of artillery and heavy tanks, necessary to breach the fortified manufacturing complexes. While these primary assaults drew the attention of Imperial commanders, smaller Ork forces made landings at dozens of secondary locations. These units, primarily composed of commandos and stormboys, targeted communication relays, power distribution nodes, and water purification facilities. Within hours, large portions of Armageddon's infrastructure had been compromised, creating confusion and panic among the civilian population and hampering the coordination of defensive efforts. Ghazghkull himself made planetfall on the third day of the invasion, establishing his headquarters in the captured ruins of Firebase Hellhound. From this central location, he could direct operations across all fronts while remaining close enough to the action to personally intervene when necessary. The command structure he implemented was unlike anything previously seen in Ork society, a hierarchical system with clear chains of authority and dedicated communication channels. Warbosses received specific objectives rather than general directives, with timetables and fallback positions included in their orders. The psychological dimension of Ghazghkull's strategy became apparent as the invasion progressed. Captured Imperial Vox networks were used to broadcast messages to the human population, not just the typical Orkish threats and battle cries, but carefully crafted propaganda designed to undermine morale. Reports of Ork atrocities were deliberately spread to population centers not yet under attack, triggering refugee movements that clogged transportation networks and complicated military deployments. In some cases, false information about Ork movements was planted, causing Imperial forces to deploy to areas where no actual threat existed. Commissar Yarrick, still serving the Imperium despite his advanced age, immediately recognized the hand of his old adversary in these sophisticated tactics. From his position at the Hades Hive Defense Coordination Center, Yarrick issued a series of directives aimed at countering Ghazghkull's psychological warfare. Vox restrictions were implemented to prevent the spread of misinformation, and commissars were deployed to key units to maintain morale. Yarrick himself made regular broadcasts to the civilian population, his distinctive voice and unflinching determination providing a counterpoint to the growing atmosphere of despair. The defense of Armageddon was complicated by leadership issues at the highest level. Governor von Straub, whose incompetence had contributed to the near disaster of the First War, insisted on maintaining operational control despite the objections of military advisors. His erratic orders and tendency to prioritize the defense of prestige targets over strategic objectives created vulnerabilities that Ghazghkull's forces quickly exploited. It was only after the fall of Hive Tartarus, a disaster that resulted in over 3 million civilian casualties, that von Straub was removed from command by inquisitorial decree. Command of Armageddon's defense passed to General Kurov of the Steel Legion, a veteran of dozens of campaigns against Xenos threats. Kurov immediately implemented a more coherent defensive strategy, consolidating forces around key hives and industrial centers while conceding less critical territories. This approach, though pragmatic, meant abandoning millions of civilians to the advancing Ork forces, a decision that weighed heavily on the general, but was necessary given the limited resources at his disposal. By the second month of the invasion, the situation had stabilized somewhat, with clear battle lines emerging across Armageddon's continents. The Orks controlled approximately 60% of the planet's surface, including 4 major hives and most of the eastern industrial zones. Imperial forces maintained control of the largest population centers and the vital manufactorum districts in the Western Hemisphere, though these areas faced constant pressure from Ork assaults. The nature of the conflict shifted from rapid maneuver warfare to a grinding war of attrition, with both sides committing massive resources to key battlefronts. The ash wastes between Hive Acheron and Hive Volcanus became a vast killing field, with Steel Legion tank companies engaged in running battles against Ork mechanized units across the toxic plains. The Death Skulls clan, serving as Ghazghkull's primary armored force, displayed unusual tactical sophistication in these engagements, using terrain features and smoke screens to mask their movements and spring ambushes on Imperial columns. In the urban environments, the fighting took on a different character. The Bad Moon's clan, with their superior equipment and fondness for firepower, led the assaults on hive structures. Building by building, level by level, they pushed deeper into the massive population centers, their advance slowed but never halted by the desperate defense of Steel Legion infantry and civilian militia. The confined spaces and complex architecture of the hives negated many of the Orks' advantages in strength and numbers, but their seemingly inexhaustible supply of fighters allowed them to absorb casualties that would have broken any human force. Throughout these battles, Commissar Yarrick emerged as the inspirational center of Imperial resistance. Despite being well over a century old, with most of his body replaced by augmetics, Yarrick led from the front in the most desperate engagements. His personal intervention turned the tide at the defense of Volcanus Bridge, where he held the critical crossing against waves of Ork attackers for 18 hours until reinforcements could arrive. The sight of the aged commissar standing defiantly amidst the carnage, his power claw dripping with Ork blood, became an iconic image reproduced in propaganda throughout the embattled hives. Ghazghkull monitored these developments with keen interest, particularly the activities of his old adversary. The Ork warlord had developed a peculiar respect for Yarrick, viewing him as a worthy opponent whose continued resistance added meaning to the conquest. In a move that puzzled his subordinates, Ghazghkull issued orders that Yarrick was to be captured rather than killed if possible, not out of mercy, but from a desire to personally break the human who had defied him for so long. This obsession culminated in a deliberate attempt to draw Yarrick into direct confrontation. Intelligence about an Ork attack on a civilian medical facility was allowed to reach Imperial command, with indications that Ghazghkull himself would be present to oversee the operation. Yarrick, recognizing the bait but unwilling to abandon the wounded to their fate, led a strike force of Steel Legion veterans to intercept the attack. The ensuing battle at St. Leonis Medical Sanctuary became one of the most intensely documented engagements of the war. Yarek's force, though outnumbered, used the complex layout of the facility to channel the Ork attackers into prepared kill zones. For hours, the defenders held their positions against increasingly furious assaults, with Yarek moving between critical points to shore up wavering sections of the line. When Ghazghkull finally entered the battle personally, smashing through the sanctuary's main gates with a retinue of heavily armored meganobs, the confrontation that had been building for decades finally materialized. Accounts of the duel between the aged commissar and the massive Ork warlord vary in details, but all agree on its ferocity. Yarek's power claw against Ghazghkull's, human determination against Orkish might, the two adversaries embodied the broader conflict between their species. The duel ended without a clear victor. A concentrated Steel Legion artillery barrage, called down on Yarek's own position in a desperate gamble, forced Ghazghkull to withdraw before either combatant could land a decisive blow. Both leaders sustained injuries. Yarek suffered 3 broken ribs and a shattered left leg, while Ghazghkull's face was scarred by a slash from Yarek's power sword that came perilously close to his eye. This inconclusive confrontation seemed to satisfy something in Ghazghkull's psychology. In the weeks that followed, the focus of Ork operations shifted away from direct assaults on Imperial strongholds toward consolidation of already captured territory. Massive fortifications were constructed around occupied hives, while looted factories were repurposed to produce war materiel for the ongoing campaign. This transition suggested a longer-term approach to the conquest, with Ghazghkull preparing for an extended occupation rather than a quick victory. The war entered a new phase in its 4th month with the arrival of significant Imperial reinforcements. 3 full companies of Space Marines from the Salamander's chapter made planetfall near Hive Tempestus, bringing with them specialized equipment for urban warfare and flame-based weapons particularly effective against Ork physiology. Their arrival coincided with the completion of General Kurov's defensive preparations, creating the conditions for the first major Imperial counteroffensive of the war. Operation Firestorm, as the counterattack was designated, targeted the Ork-held industrial sector in the Kar-Mordian district. The offensive began with a massive artillery bombardment using incendiary munitions, followed by coordinated advances by Salamander Astartes and Steel Legion mechanized infantry. The operation achieved initial success, reclaiming several key manufacturing facilities and pushing the Ork forces back nearly 20 kilometers along a broad front. Ghazghkull's response to this setback demonstrated his strategic flexibility. Rather than committing additional forces to contest the lost territory directly, he ordered a series of diversionary attacks against weakly defended targets elsewhere on the planet. These attacks forced General Kurov to divert resources from the main offensive to protect vulnerable population centers, bleeding momentum from Operation Firestorm and ultimately bringing the advance to a halt before its primary objectives could be achieved. As the war approached its 6th month, an unexpected development altered its trajectory. Inquisitorial agents operating behind Ork lines reported unusual movement patterns among Ghazghkull's elite units. Analysis of these movements, combined with intercepted communications and psychic divinations, led to a startling conclusion: Ghazghkull was preparing to leave Armageddon. This assessment was initially met with skepticism among Imperial commanders. The idea that an Ork warlord would abandon a campaign at the height of its success contradicted everything known about greenskin psychology, yet the evidence continued to mount. Supply ships were being diverted from frontline units to Ghazghkull's personal fleet. Elite formations were withdrawing from active combat zones and returning to orbital staging areas. The massive war engines that had spearheaded the initial invasion were being loaded onto transport vessels rather than deployed to ongoing battles. Yarek, perhaps understanding his adversary better than anyone else in the Imperium, offered the most convincing explanation for this unexpected behavior. In a secure communication to Segmentum Command, he suggested that Ghazghkull's ultimate goal was not the conquest of Armageddon itself, but the creation of a perpetual conflict that would draw in ever-increasing Imperial resources. By withdrawing at the peak of his success, Ghazghkull would ensure that significant Imperial forces remained tied to Armageddon's defense, unable to respond to threats elsewhere, while he was free to pursue new conquests. This analysis proved prescient. In the 8th month of the war, Ghazghkull departed Armageddon with approximately 1/3 of his original invasion force, leaving the remainder under the command of subordinate warbosses with orders to continue the campaign. His flagship, accompanied by dozens of support vessels, broke through the weakened Imperial blockade and disappeared into the warp before pursuit could be organized. The departure of the primary architect of the invasion did not immediately improve the situation for Armageddon's defenders. The remaining Ork forces, though somewhat diminished in coordination and strategic direction, still outnumbered the Imperial defenders and controlled vast swathes of territory. Without Ghazghkull's restraining influence, some warbosses actually increased the ferocity of their attacks, seeking to establish dominance in the new hierarchy. The transformation of Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka from a formidable warlord into a living engine of destruction began in the aftermath of the First War for Armageddon. As his flagship cut through the void toward Golgotha, the prophet of Gork and Mork summoned his personal painboy to his private chambers. Mad Doc Grotznik arrived carrying a crate of surgical implements, his blood-stained apron adorned with various mechanical components, and his augmetic eye whirring as it focused on his most important patient. "Do gods want more?" Ghazghkull growled, his massive frame dominating the chamber. "Make me bigger, make me arder." The relationship between Ghazghkull and Grotznik had evolved far beyond the typical Ork warlord and his medical attendant. Since that first crude surgery that had installed the metal plate in Ghazghkull's skull, Grotznik had become both the prophet's personal physician and his biological architect. The painboy approached his work with a combination of religious reverence and mad scientific curiosity, viewing Ghazghkull's body as both canvas and temple. The augmentation process that began on that voyage would continue for years, transforming Ghazghkull into something that pushed the boundaries of what even Ork biology could sustain. The first major enhancement focused on his skeletal structure. Grotznik replaced key bones with adamantium-reinforced substitutes, starting with the spine and ribcage. These weren't simple metal replacements, but bioengineered composites that integrated with Ghazghkull's natural healing and growth processes, allowing them to strengthen as his Waaagh energy increased. Muscular enhancement followed, with Grotznik implanting a network of hydraulic fibers throughout Ghazghkull's major muscle groups. These synthetic tissues worked in concert with his natural musculature, multiplying his already formidable strength. The procedure was excruciating, performed with minimal anesthesia, as Grotznik believed pain improved the integration process. Ghazghkull endured these sessions without complaint, interpreting the agony as a test from Gork and Mork. Perhaps the most significant augmentation came in the form of Ghazghkull's nervous system modifications. Grotznik installed a secondary neural network of copper-based conductive material that bypassed damaged pathways and accelerated reaction times. This enhancement gave Ghazghkull combat reflexes that seemed impossible for a creature of his size, allowing him to react to threats with the speed of an orc half his mass. The physical results of these augmentations became increasingly apparent as Ghazghkull's Waaagh gathered momentum. By the time of the Second War for Armageddon, he stood nearly 4 meters tall, his massive frame bulging with muscle and metal. His skin, already naturally tough, had been further reinforced with subcutaneous armor plating that could deflect Law's fire and even withstand glancing hits from bolter rounds. The original metal plate in his skull had been expanded into a full cranial casing, protecting his brain while amplifying his connection to the Waaagh energy field. Grotznik's most visible contribution to Ghazghkull's transformation was the replacement of his left arm with a massive power claw. The first iteration, installed after a battle with Eldar forces left his original limb mangled beyond recovery, was a relatively simple mechanical prosthetic with hydraulic pistons providing crushing force. Over successive upgrades, this basic design evolved into a masterpiece of Orkish engineering, incorporating scavenged power field technology and adamantium alloy blades capable of slicing through tank armor. The claw, which Ghazghkull named the Claw of Gork, became as much a symbol of his authority as his metal-plated skull. Its internal mechanisms were powered by a miniature reactor salvaged from an Imperial knight, providing enough energy to maintain the power field for extended periods without the fluctuations typical of Ork technology. The control systems were directly integrated with Ghazghkull's nervous system, allowing him to operate the complex appendage with the same precision as a natural limb. Complementing the claw was a shoulder-mounted twin-linked Shuda, a weapon that would have required a normal Ork to brace against recoil. For Ghazghkull, it served as little more than a sidearm, useful for clearing infantry, while he closed distance to more worthy opponents. The weapon's barrels were inscribed with glyphs representing Gork and Mork, and it fired specialized ammunition crafted by Dregmek's most talented apprentices. The cumulative effect of these enhancements made Ghazghkull nearly unrecognizable from the Ork Nob, who had first experienced prophetic visions on Urk. Imperial picked captures from the two Armageddon conflicts, analyzed side by side, revealed a being who had nearly doubled in size and mass. Inquisitorial reports classified him not merely as an Ork warboss, but as something approaching the legendary beast of ancient Terra, a comparison that would prove increasingly apt as his power continued to grow. Ghazghkull's physical transformation was matched by the evolution of his personal wargear. During the consolidation period on Golgotha, he commissioned the creation of custom mega armor that would accommodate his enhanced frame while providing additional protection and combat capabilities. The result was a masterpiece of Orkish engineering that combined salvaged Imperial technology with traditional greenskin craftsmanship. The armor's external plates were fashioned from the hull of an Imperial Baneblade super heavy tank, providing protection that could withstand direct hits from heavy weapons. Beneath these visible components lay a complex system of shock absorbers and stabilizers that distributed impact energy and maintained mobility despite the armor's considerable weight. The joints featured hydraulic assistance systems that amplified Ghazghkull's movements rather than restricting them, making him faster in the armor than many unarmored Orks. The helmet component was particularly distinctive, featuring a horned silhouette reminiscent of ancient Terran war masks. The faceplate incorporated targeting systems salvaged from Space Marine equipment, providing enhanced visual input directly to Ghazghkull's augmented brain. The helmet's most important feature, however, was the psychic amplifier built into its crown, a device of Grotznik's design that strengthened Ghazghkull's connection to the Waaagh energy field and clarified his visions from Gork and Mork. Power for this formidable suit came from multiple redundant generators built into the back plate. The primary power source was a modified Imperial plasma reactor, its unstable tendencies actually harnessed as a feature rather than a flaw. If damaged beyond certain parameters, the reactor could be deliberately overloaded to create a devastating explosion, a last act of defiance if Ghazghkull should ever face defeat. The combined effect of these biological and technological enhancements created a being that transcended normal Orkish limitations. In combat, Ghazghkull moved with a speed and precision that belied his enormous size. Witness accounts from the Second War for Armageddon described him tearing through Space Marine squads with terrifying efficiency, his claws shearing through ceramite armor, while bullets and Laz bolts bounced harmlessly off his own protection. A particularly notable demonstration of his capabilities came during the battle for Firebase Hades, where a full squad of Terminators from the Salamanders chapter engaged him directly. Despite their formidable armor and weapons, 5 of the elite warriors fell within the first minute of combat. The survivors described Ghazghkull anticipating their movements with uncanny accuracy, as though he could perceive their intentions before they acted. This heightened combat awareness, likely a result of his neural enhancements and psychic sensitivity, made him nearly impossible to outmaneuver. The psychological impact of Ghazghkull's transformed appearance extended beyond the battlefield. Among his own followers, his massive stature and obvious augmentations reinforced his status as the chosen of Gork and Mork. Orks naturally respect size and strength, but Ghazghkull's enhancements placed him in a category beyond normal hierarchical considerations. He wasn't merely the biggest and strongest, he was physically different, a living embodiment of what an Ork could become with divine favor. For Imperial forces, Ghazghkull's appearance inspired a different kind of awe. The sight of his massive form striding through the smoke of battle, seemingly impervious to weapons that would fell any other creature, created a sense of hopelessness that conventional Ork warbosses rarely achieved. His distinctive silhouette became a symbol of terror in Imperial propaganda, with defensive briefings focusing on avoiding direct engagement rather than strategies for defeating him. This transformation did not come without costs. The extensive augmentation process created chronic pain that even Ghazghkull's remarkable tolerance was tested by. Grotznik developed specialized pain management systems that pumped combat stimulants and analgesics directly into his bloodstream, but these were temporary measures that often resulted in periods of crash and recovery after extended exertion. During these vulnerable phases, Ghazghkull would retreat to his private chambers, attended only by Grotznik and his most trusted lieutenants. There were also psychological effects that manifested in increasingly frequent mood swings and periods of introspection unusual for an Ork. The metal plate in his skull expanded into a full cranial casing, sometimes generated feedback loops in his neural pathways that resulted in sensory overload or temporary dissociation. Grotznik viewed these episodes as moments of divine communion rather than medical complications, encouraging Ghazghkull to embrace them as opportunities for deeper connection with Gork and Mork. These private struggles remained largely hidden from both his followers and enemies, visible only in occasional moments of uncharacteristic stillness, amidst the chaos of battle or sudden shifts in tactical approach that surprised his own commanders. What most observers saw was only the external result, a warlord of unprecedented power whose physical presence matched his strategic genius. The full extent of Ghazghkull's capabilities became apparent during the later stages of the Second War for Armageddon. During the siege of Hive Tartarus, Imperial defenders deployed a Knight Paladin to counter an Ork advance through the main manufacturing district. The massive war machine cut through the greenskin forces with contemptuous ease until Ghazghkull personally intercepted it. Witnesses described the ensuing confrontation as less a battle than a systematic dismantling. Ghazghkull avoided the Knight's thermal cannon while targeting its leg joints with precision strikes from his power claw, eventually toppling the war machine before tearing open its cockpit to extract the pilot. This incident highlighted another aspect of Ghazghkull's enhanced nature, his ability to analyze complex opponents and identify weaknesses with a tactical acumen rare among Orks. The metal plate in his skull, originally installed by Grotznik after a devastating head wound, had evolved from a simple repair into a cognitive enhancement that processed battlefield information with computer-like efficiency. Combined with his natural Orkish cunning and the strategic insights gained through his prophetic visions, this created a commander capable of outthinking opponents with millennia more experience. The comparison to the Beast, the ancient Ork warlord who had nearly conquered Terra itself during the War of the Beast in the 32nd Millennium, became increasingly apt as Ghazghkull's power grew. Historical records of that earlier conflict described an Ork leader of enormous size and intelligence, capable of speaking Gothic and directing complex military operations across multiple star systems. While Ghazghkull had not yet demonstrated all these capabilities, the trajectory of his development pointed towards similar potential. Inquisitorial threat assessments following the Second War for Armageddon officially classified Ghazghkull as a prime Ork, a designation previously reserved for theoretical discussions of the Beast and his direct subordinates. This classification acknowledged that he represented something beyond the normal evolutionary path of even the most successful Ork warlords. The combination of his natural growth, Grotznik's enhancements, and the psychic amplification of his connection to the Waaagh energy had created something unprecedented in the current era. The most disturbing aspect of this assessment was the recognition that Ghazghkull might still be evolving. Each major conflict seemed to accelerate his development, with the Waaagh energy generated by millions of Orks under his command feeding back into his own physical and mental growth. If this process continued unchecked, projections suggested he could eventually reach capabilities matching or exceeding those attributed to the Beast, a prospect that prompted some radical Inquisition factions to advocate for exterminatus on any world where he established a significant presence. Despite these concerns, conventional military responses remain the Imperium's primary approach to containing the threat Ghazghkull represented. The difficulty of this task was compounded by his increasing tendency to withdraw from conflicts before Imperial forces could concentrate their full strength against him, as demonstrated at the conclusion of the Second War for Armageddon. This strategic mobility, unusual for an Ork warlord, suggested a level of long-term planning that further distinguished him from his predecessors. As Ghazghkull's legend grew, so too did the cult of personality surrounding him among Ork societies across the galaxy. Even greenskins who had never fought under his direct command began adopting elements of his appearance and tactical approach. Crude replicas of his distinctive armor and claw became status symbols among ambitious knobs, while his strategic innovations spread through Ork culture like a contagion, elevating the overall threat posed by even unaffiliated warbands. The battlefield tactics employed by most Ork warbosses could be described as straightforward at best. Gather the biggest mob possible, point them at the enemy, and unleash them with a thunderous Waaagh. While effective through sheer weight of numbers, this approach rarely evolved beyond variations of the frontal assault. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, however, represented something entirely different, a fundamental evolution in Orkish strategic thinking that transformed him from a brutal warlord into perhaps the most sophisticated military mind ever produced by his species. The seeds of this tactical evolution were present even in Ghazghkull's earliest campaigns on Urk. While other knobs relied solely on personal strength to maintain authority, Ghazghkull demonstrated an instinctive understanding of force concentration and battlefield geometry. His ambush of rival warboss Urgok Facekrumpa at Red Gorge showed a grasp of terrain advantages that would have impressed Imperial tacticians. By channeling his opponent's forces into a narrow defile and attacking from multiple elevations, he negated Urgok's numerical advantage and created conditions for a decisive victory. This innate tactical sense underwent dramatic refinement during the consolidation period on Golgotha. Freed from immediate battlefield pressures, Ghazghkull devoted considerable time to analyzing the failures of his first Armageddon campaign. He had mechboys construct crude tactical simulators using salvaged Imperial technology, allowing him to replay key engagements and experiment with alternative approaches. These devices, which combined mechanical moving parts with rudimentary holographic displays, became a regular fixture in his command chamber. The most significant innovation Ghazghkull introduced to Ork warfare was the concept of operational phases with distinct objectives. Traditional Ork attacks consisted of a single continuous push until either victory or defeat. Ghazghkull, however, began dividing his campaigns into preparatory, primary, and exploitation phases. The preparatory phase focused on intelligence gathering, resource positioning, and targeted elimination of key enemy capabilities. The primary phase involved main force engagements designed to break enemy cohesion rather than simply inflict casualties. The exploitation phase capitalized on breakthrough points with mobile elements to disrupt command structures and supply lines. This phased approach was evident during the Second War for Armageddon, where commando units systematically disabled orbital defense platforms before the main fleet arrived, a preparatory action that significantly reduced initial losses. Similarly, the primary landings targeted communication hubs and transportation nexuses rather than population centers, isolating Imperial defensive zones from each other before they could be engaged directly. Perhaps most impressive was Ghazghkull's evolution in coordinating different Ork clan forces. The tribal nature of Ork society traditionally made inter-clan cooperation minimal and inefficient, with each group fighting essentially its own war within the larger conflict. Ghazghkull transformed this limitation into a strength by assigning specialized roles that aligned with each clan's natural proclivities. The Evil Sunts, with their cultural obsession with speed, were organized into rapid response battalions that could quickly reinforce threatened sectors or exploit breakthroughs. Rather than attempting to make them fight in a manner contrary to their nature, Ghazghkull channeled their desire for fast-moving combat towards strategic objectives. During the Ash Wastes campaign on Armageddon, Evil Sunt speed freaks conducted deep penetration raids that disrupted Imperial supply lines while avoiding direct confrontation with heavy armor units. The Bad Moons, known for their superior equipment and firepower, were positioned as fire support elements that could deliver sustained bombardment of enemy positions. Their natural tendency toward showing off their weapons was directed into competition for achieving the most impressive destructive effects on designated targets. The Siege of Hive Acheron demonstrated this approach, with Bad Moon's artillery batteries maintaining a coordinated firing schedule that systematically eliminated defensive positions according to a predetermined sequence rather than randomly targeting whatever caught their attention. The Goths, Ghazghkull's own clan, provided the disciplined core of his assault forces. Their straightforward approach to combat made them ideal for main force engagements where determined advances were required. During the Battle of Tartarus Manufacturing Complex, Goth units maintained cohesion through 3 days of continuous combat, rotating frontline elements to maintain pressure while allowing recovery periods, a level of coordination previously unseen in Ork warfare. The Death Skulls, with their talent for scavenging and technical improvisation, were employed as specialized engineering units and equipment recovery teams. Rather than simply looting for personal gain, they were directed to prioritize salvage operations that could yield materials for specific projects. The rapid establishment of forward bases during the Armageddon campaign owed much to Deathskull teams who could transform ruined Imperial facilities into operational Ork strongpoints within hours. Even the Blood Axes, often distrusted by other Orks for their willingness to adopt non-Orkish tactics, found a valued place in Ghazghkull's structure. Their experience with human military methods made them effective intelligence gatherers and liaison officers between different clan forces. Blood Axe commandos provided detailed information about Imperial defensive arrangements that proved crucial to planning the Second Armageddon invasion. This clan integration represented more than simple task allocation. It created a combined arms approach that multiplied the effectiveness of each component. When Imperial commanders expected to face disjointed bands of greenskins, they instead encountered coordinated operations, where Goth infantry advances were supported by Bad Moon's fire missions, with Evil Sunt's fast attack units exploiting any breakthroughs, while Deathskull's technical teams quickly fortified gained ground. Ghazghkull's understanding of Imperial military doctrine proved particularly valuable in developing countermeasures to Space Marine deployment tactics. Standard Adeptus Astartes shock assault doctrine relied on rapid insertion of small, elite units at critical junctures to disrupt enemy operations before they could fully develop. Recognizing this pattern, Ghazghkull developed what he called trap zones, areas deliberately left vulnerable to invite Space Marine deployment, but surrounded by concealed heavy weapons teams specifically positioned to engage Astartes armor. This tactic proved devastatingly effective during the Battle of Volcanus Ridge, where a Salamander's strike force deployed via drop pod into what appeared to be a weakly defended command post. Once the Space Marines were committed, hidden tank-buster teams emerged from pre-prepared positions with lines of fire specifically calculated to target Astartes' weak points. The resulting ambush inflicted casualties that would have been impossible in a conventional engagement. Ghazghkull's tactical innovations extended to void warfare as well. Traditional Ork fleet actions relied on closing to boarding range as quickly as possible, accepting significant losses to bring their superior numbers to bear in hand-to-hand combat. While maintaining this core approach, Ghazghkull introduced the concept of shield ships, heavily armored vessels whose sole purpose was to absorb enemy fire while faster attack craft maneuvered into optimal positions. This approach, first employed during the Void Battle for Armageddon, reduced initial losses by nearly 40% compared to typical Ork fleet engagements. The development of the Green Tide strategy represented perhaps Ghazghkull's most significant contribution to Ork warfare. This approach moved beyond the natural Ork tendency toward mass assault by introducing wave mechanics and psychological factors. The first wave consisted primarily of Gretchen and lighter infantry units, whose purpose was not to achieve breakthrough, but to deplete enemy ammunition and identify defensive strong points. The second wave targeted identified weaknesses with specialist units including tankbustas, burna boys, or commandos, depending on the nature of the resistance. Only when these preparatory waves had created favorable conditions would the main assault be launched, typically led by nobs and elite units with Ghazghkull himself often at the spearhead. This methodical approach maximized the impact of the Orks' numerical advantage while minimizing the effectiveness of Imperial defensive preparations. The psychological effect on defenders was particularly devastating, surviving the first waves only to face fresh, elite opponents often broke morale in ways that a single massive assault would not have achieved. Equally impressive was Ghazghkull's adaptation of his tactics to counter specific Imperial units. Recognizing the threat posed by Imperial Guard artillery, he developed infiltration protocols for commando units that prioritized targeting Basilisk and Manticore batteries before they could range in on Ork concentrations. Against Astra Militarum armor, he employed swarm tactics with cheap, expendable units carrying just enough anti-tank weaponry to achieve mobility kills, saving his heavy assets for exploiting the resulting breakthroughs. The evolution of Ghazghkull's command structure paralleled his tactical innovations. Traditional Ork warbands operated with minimal hierarchy. A warboss gave general directions, and individual Orks fought as they saw fit. Ghazghkull introduced a tiered leadership system, with nobs serving as sub-commanders responsible for specific battlefield sectors or functional areas. These nobs received actual operational briefings rather than simply being pointed toward the enemy, complete with fallback positions, support coordination signals, and specific objectives. Communication, traditionally a weakness in Ork military operations, received particular attention. Ghazghkull established a corps of shoutas, Orks with particularly powerful voices augmented with crude vox amplifiers, who relayed standardized command phrases across the battlefield. This system, while primitive compared to Imperial communication networks, represented a significant improvement over the typical Orkish approach of simply yelling louder when important information needed to be conveyed. Perhaps most remarkably, Ghazghkull developed contingency planning, a concept virtually unknown in traditional Ork warfare. Rather than simply reacting to battlefield developments, he prepared alternative approaches for different scenarios. During the Hemlock refinery assault on Armageddon, Imperial defenders were surprised when their successful defense of the main processing facility was immediately followed by an Ork attack on the previously untargeted pipeline network. An alternative objective Ghazghkull had prepared in advance should the primary target prove too costly to take. The sophistication of Ghazghkull's approach became evident in his handling of battlefield reversals. Where typical Ork forces would fight to the last when cornered, Ghazghkull instituted tactical withdrawals that preserved valuable units for future operations. During the Battle of Deathmire on Armageddon, when Space Wolves' counterattacks threatened to encircle a significant Ork force, Ghazghkull ordered a phased withdrawal that extracted 70% of his heavy assets, while sacrificial rearguards delayed pursuit. This preservation of combat power allowed him to launch a successful counter-attack 3 days later, when Imperial forces had overextended their supply lines. Ghazghkull's strategic vision extended far beyond individual battles or even campaigns. His departure from Armageddon at the height of the Second War, initially perceived as erratic behavior by Imperial analysts, revealed itself as part of a broader galactic strategy. By leaving substantial forces behind under subordinate commanders, he ensured that Imperial resources would remain committed to Armageddon while he pursued objectives elsewhere. This approach effectively transformed a single planetary conflict into a sector-wide threat, forcing Imperial commanders to defend multiple systems simultaneously against an enemy who could concentrate forces at will. The true measure of Ghazghkull's tactical genius lay not just in his personal innovations, but in how these methods spread throughout Ork society. Nobs who served under him carried these approaches to new warbands when they established their own leadership. The concept of phased operations, combined arms tactics, and even basic battlefield communication systems began appearing in Ork forces with no direct connection to Ghazghkull's Waaagh, suggesting a fundamental evolution in Orkish warfare driven by his example. For Imperial defenders, this evolutionary leap created unprecedented challenges. Defense plans developed against traditional Ork behavior patterns proved inadequate against forces employing Ghazghkull-inspired tactics. The predictable Green Tide became a coordinated assault with specialized elements targeting critical vulnerabilities. Defensive strongpoints carefully positioned to withstand frontal assaults found themselves outflanked by fast-moving elements or undermined by infiltration teams. Even the psychological comfort of facing an intellectually inferior foe was stripped away, as Ork forces demonstrated adaptability and tactical awareness previously considered impossible for their species. The skies above Armageddon darkened once more in 998 of the 41st millennium, as Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka returned with a vengeance. The invasion force he had assembled dwarfed his previous campaigns in both scale and sophistication. Imperial augur arrays detected the approaching armada nearly 3 weeks before its arrival, but even this early warning proved insufficient against the sheer magnitude of the onslaught that followed. The fleet that translated from the warp represented the culmination of Ghazghkull's decades of preparation. Over 5,000 vessels of various sizes emerged in system-wide formation, from nimble attack craft to massive space hulks that had been retrofitted as troop carriers and assault platforms. Most imposing among these was Ghazghkull's flagship, a colossal space hulk designated by Imperial forces as Deathdila, a conglomeration of ancient vessels fused together over millennia and transformed by Ork mechboys into a mobile fortress bristling with weapons salvaged from a dozen different species. Unlike the relatively straightforward approach of his previous invasions, Ghazghkull's fleet arrived in carefully coordinated waves. The first consisted primarily of smaller craft designed to overwhelm orbital defense platforms through sheer numbers. As Imperial gunners exhausted their ammunition on these sacrificial vessels, the second wave emerged at different translation points, bypassing weakened defensive zones to establish geosynchronous positions above key planetary targets. Lord General Kurov, who had assumed command of Armageddon's defenses following the disastrous leadership of von Straub during the previous conflict, immediately recognized the strategic sophistication of the attack. "This is not the same beast we faced before," he reportedly told his command staff. "He has learned from every engagement, every victory, every defeat." The orbital battle lasted just 14 hours, less than half the duration of the Void War during the Second Invasion. Imperial Navy elements fought valiantly, but were systematically isolated and overwhelmed by Ork vessels that displayed unprecedented coordination. The cruiser Eternal Vigilance, commanding the defense of the Northern Hemisphere, reported engaging Ork ships that executed actual void combat maneuvers rather than simply charging forward into weapons range. As the orbital defenses collapsed, the ground invasion began with a precision that shocked Imperial commanders. Rather than the typical Orkish approach of landing wherever seemed convenient, Ghazghkull's forces touched down in carefully selected zones that isolated major population centers from each other while securing key infrastructure. Most significantly, the initial landings avoided direct assaults on heavily fortified hives, instead establishing control over transportation networks and communication hubs. The centerpiece of Ghazghkull's ground assault was his deployment of massive war engines, unlike anything seen in previous conflicts. Most terrifying among these were the Gargants, towering mechanical constructs that combined elements of Imperial Titans with distinctive Orkish brutality. Standing over 30 meters tall, these walking fortresses carried enough firepower to level city blocks with a single volley. Imperial defenders who had faced Gargants during the Second War found these new variants significantly more resilient and better armed, suggesting that Ghazghkull's mechboys had refined their designs based on previous battlefield performance. Complementing these behemoths were squadrons of Stampas, smaller but more numerous war machines that served as mobile command centers for ground operations. Each Stampa carried not just devastating weapons, but sophisticated communication equipment that allowed Ghazghkull's lieutenants to coordinate across vast distances. The tactical flexibility this provided became apparent when Imperial counterattacks that succeeded against one Ork formation found themselves quickly engaged by reinforcements from completely different sectors. Perhaps most innovative were the mecha dreads, cybernetic constructs that housed the preserved nervous systems of fallen Ork knobs in mechanical bodies. These abominations combined the tactical experience of veteran warriors with mechanical durability that made them nearly impossible to destroy with conventional weapons. Each mecha doctor served as a sub-commander for specialized assault groups, bringing a level of coordination to Ork operations that had previously required direct oversight from senior warbosses. The space hulks that had delivered these war machines remained in low orbit, serving as both orbital fire support platforms and staging areas for continued landings. Their massive guns, many salvaged from Imperial battleships or defense installations, could target positions anywhere on the planet's surface with devastating accuracy. When Steel Legion artillery batteries attempted to establish firing positions against advancing Ork columns, they frequently found themselves targeted by orbital strikes before they could complete their deployments. Ghazghkull's use of these space hulks represented a significant evolution in his strategic thinking. Rather than simply employing them as transportation, he had transformed them into mobile fortresses that could project power across entire continents. Each hulk maintained geostationary position above a specific operational zone, providing continuous support to ground forces while remaining beyond the reach of most planetary defenses. The psychological impact of these looming behemoths, visible even in daylight as dark silhouettes against the sky, proved as damaging to civilian morale as their actual firepower. The psychological dimension of Ghazghkull's strategy extended well beyond the intimidation factor of his war machines. Imperial intelligence intercepted Ork communications that revealed a deliberate targeting of symbolic locations, monuments to Imperial victories in previous wars, shrines to notable heroes, and administrative centers representing Imperial authority. These targets often had limited military value, but their destruction undermined civilian confidence in the Imperium's ability to protect its cultural foundations. Most pointed among these symbolic attacks was the assault on the Commissar Yarrick Memorial Hospital in Hive Hellsreach. The facility, named after the legendary defender of Armageddon, who had since departed to hunt Ghazghkull across the stars, was completely destroyed despite being located several kilometers from any legitimate military target. Survivors reported that the Ork forces responsible specifically sought out and demolished the statue of Yarrick that had stood in the hospital's central courtyard, taking the severed head with them as a trophy. This targeting of Yarrick's legacy appeared frequently throughout the campaign. Ork propaganda broadcasts, transmitted on captured Imperial frequencies, repeatedly referenced Old Baal Eye and questioned why Armageddon's greatest defender was absent when needed most. These taunts, delivered in crude but understandable Low Gothic, demonstrated Ghazghkull's understanding of Imperial psychology and his ability to exploit perceived weaknesses in enemy morale. The propaganda extended to psychological warfare against Imperial Guard units as well. Ork commandos infiltrated behind defensive lines to leave mutilated bodies arranged in ways that would be discovered by relief forces. Voxcasters dropped into civilian areas broadcast recordings of human screams interspersed with Orkish laughter. Supply convoys arrived at besieged outposts to find the roads lined with crucified guardsmen, positioned to be clearly visible, but just out of rescue range. These tactics represented a significant departure from traditional Orkish warfare, which typically focused on direct confrontation rather than psychological manipulation. Imperial commanders who had faced greenskins in previous campaigns found themselves unprepared for an enemy that understood and exploited human psychological vulnerabilities. Commissariat reports from this period noted a sharp increase in cases of combat stress and desertion compared to the Second War, despite improved material conditions and better strategic positioning. As the invasion progressed into its second month, a clear pattern emerged in Ghazghkull's operational approach. Rather than attempting to capture and hold territory in the traditional sense, his forces focused on destroying infrastructure and disrupting Imperial command and control. Manufactorum districts that produced war material were reduced to rubble. Power generation facilities were systematically targeted, plunging hive cities into darkness. Water purification plants were contaminated with toxic waste, creating humanitarian crises that diverted Imperial resources from military operations. The cumulative effect of these actions was to transform Armageddon into a planet-wide disaster zone where Imperial forces found themselves fighting not just Orks, but collapsing infrastructure, civilian panic, and resource shortages. Lord General Kurov, in a secure communication to Segmentum Command, described the situation as fighting an enemy who understands our logistical dependencies better than many of our own officers. Despite the devastating effectiveness of this approach, Imperial defenders noted a curious restraint in certain aspects of Ghazghkull's campaign. Population centers with no military significance were sometimes bypassed entirely rather than destroyed. Captured Imperial guardsmen reported being disarmed and released rather than executed. Food storage facilities were occasionally left untouched, even when military targets in the same area were obliterated. This selective destruction suggested a strategic vision that extended beyond simple conquest or annihilation. Inquisitorial analysis proposed that Ghazghkull was deliberately creating conditions for a protracted conflict rather than seeking decisive victory. By preserving certain civilian infrastructure and population centers, he ensured that Armageddon would remain valuable enough for the Imperium to continue committing resources to its defense rather than resorting to exterminatus. The theory gained credence when, approximately 3 months into the campaign, Ghazghkull's direct participation in ground operations abruptly ceased. Imperial intelligence assets tracked his return to the Deathdealer Hulk, followed by its departure from Armageddon orbit, along with approximately 1/3 of the original invasion fleet. The remaining forces, still numbering in the millions, continued their operations under the command of subordinate warbosses with no apparent reduction in effectiveness. This development confounded Imperial strategists who had built their defensive plans around eventually forcing a decisive engagement with Ghazghkull himself. Commissar Yarrick, contacted via astropathic message at his position 3 sectors away, provided the most convincing interpretation. He never intended to stay. Armageddon is not his target, it is his bait. Every regiment sent here is one that cannot oppose him elsewhere. Subsequent events validated this assessment. Within weeks of departing Armageddon, elements of Ghazghkull's fleet were confirmed attacking Imperial holdings in the Pisces sector. Simultaneously, Ork forces bearing his distinctive tribal markings launched raids against supply convoys bound for Armageddon from Waaagh. A pattern emerged of coordinated attacks across multiple sectors, each individually manageable but collectively stretching Imperial response capabilities to their limit. Meanwhile, the situation on Armageddon itself deteriorated into a grinding war of attrition. The remaining Ork forces, operating under the command of Warboss Urgrok Killfist, continued to follow the strategic template established during the initial invasion. Selective destruction of infrastructure combined with psychological warfare maintained pressure on Imperial defenders while preserving conditions for continued conflict. Imperial reinforcements arrived continuously, with elements from over 30 different guard regiments eventually committed to the defense of Armageddon. Space Marine forces from 6 different chapters established permanent presences on the planet, including substantial deployments from the Salamanders and Black Templars. This massive commitment of resources achieved tactical victories, but failed to decisively alter the strategic situation, exactly as Ghazghkull had apparently intended. The most significant development in the conflict came approximately 6 months after Ghazghkull's departure, when Imperial astropaths detected a massive disturbance in the warp approaching Armageddon. Initial fears of additional Ork reinforcements proved unfounded when the new arrivals were identified as a Chaos fleet led by Karn the Betrayer, infamous champion of Khorne. This unexpected third faction transformed the already complex conflict into a 3-way struggle, with Chaos forces apparently drawn by the enormous bloodshed already unleashed. This development seemed to validate another aspect of inquisitorial analysis, that Ghazghkull understood the attractor effect that massive conflicts created in the warp. By igniting a war of sufficient scale on Armageddon, he had created conditions that would inevitably draw additional factions into the fighting, further complicating Imperial response efforts, and ensuring that the conflict would continue indefinitely, even without his direct involvement. The strategic brilliance of this approach became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Imperial forces could neither withdraw from Armageddon, given its industrial importance and the symbolic significance of abandoning it to Xenos forces, nor achieve decisive victory against an enemy that continued to receive reinforcements through a self-sustaining cycle of violence. Each new faction drawn to the conflict created additional complications that required further commitment of Imperial resources. Meanwhile, Ghazghkull himself remained free to pursue his broader strategic objectives across the galaxy. The Waaagh energy generated by the continuous fighting on Armageddon strengthened his connection to Gork and Mork, enhancing his prophetic abilities and allowing him to coordinate Ork activities across unprecedented distances. Intercepted communications suggested he was actively recruiting additional warbosses to his cause, expanding his influence throughout Ork society by demonstrating the effectiveness of his strategic approach. The full scope of Ghazghkull's vision became clearer with each passing month as reports arrived of coordinated Ork activities in sectors previously untouched by greenskin influence. These weren't simply random raids, but calculated operations that targeted specific Imperial capabilities, Mechanicus research stations, astropathic relay facilities, navigator houses, and munitions production centers. The pattern suggested not just a war of conquest, but a systematic effort to degrade the Imperium's ability to respond to threats across multiple fronts. Following his calculated withdrawal from Armageddon, Ghazghkull's path led him into the tumultuous region known as the Octarius sector. This vast expanse of space, located in the galactic southeast of the Imperium, had long been the site of a devastating conflict between two of the galaxy's most prolific species, the Orks and the Tyranids. Imperial strategists had observed this war with grim satisfaction, hoping these Xenos threats would deplete each other's strength in what Inquisitor Kryptman had termed the perfect trap. Ghazghkull's arrival in this theater changed everything. His fleet translated from the warp at the edges of the Octarius sector in early 999 of the 41st Millennium, avoiding the heaviest concentrations of both Ork and Tyranid forces. Rather than immediately throwing his considerable military might into the existing conflict, Ghazghkull spent several months observing the ebb and flow of battle between the warring Xenos. Auspex data captured by Imperial scout vessels showed his flagship maintaining position at the system's periphery, launching only small reconnaissance craft that slipped between the larger engagements. This period of observation reflected Ghazghkull's evolved strategic thinking. Where most Ork warlords would have eagerly joined the largest fight available, Ghazghkull demonstrated remarkable restraint. Through his network of commando and specialized scout vessels, he gathered intelligence on Tyranid adaptation patterns, hive fleet movements, and the responses of the indigenous Ork empires led by various warlords throughout the sector. The first indication of Ghazghkull's true intentions came when his forces made planetfall on Octaria 4, a contested world where Ork forces under warlord Zogfang had been gradually losing ground to Tyranid hive fleet Leviathan. Rather than simply reinforcing Zogfang's positions, Ghazghkull's troops established separate enclaves in the planet's equatorial mountain ranges, defensible positions from which he could observe the conflict while maintaining his independence. When Zogfang predictably challenged this intrusion into his territory, Ghazghkull's response demonstrated his growing diplomatic sophistication. Instead of immediately crushing the lesser warlord as might be expected, he invited Zogfang to a parley on neutral ground. Imperial xenobiologists who later examined records of this meeting noted that Ghazghkull employed a complex blend of intimidation, respect, and strategic reasoning to convince Zogfang of the benefits of cooperation against the Tyranid threat. The resulting alliance transformed the war on Octaria IV. Under Ghazghkull's guidance, Ork forces abandoned their traditional scattered approach to warfare and adopted coordinated defensive perimeters. Mechboys were directed to develop weapons specifically tailored to combat Tyranid biological adaptations, resulting in innovations like the Bug Zappa, a modified force field that produced energy waves particularly disruptive to Tyranid synaptic connections. Perhaps most significantly, Ghazghkull introduced the concept of strategic withdrawal to Zogfang's forces. Rather than fighting to the last Ork in overrun positions, units were trained to fall back to prepared secondary lines when faced with overwhelming numbers. This preservation of fighting strength allowed the Greenskins to maintain consistent pressure against the Tyranids, who had evolved their tactics based on the expectation of Orkish suicidal last stands. The effectiveness of these changes became apparent within weeks. Tyranid advances that had been steadily consuming Ork territory for months suddenly stalled. Synaptic organisms found themselves targeted by specialized Ork hunter-killer teams, disrupting the hive mind's control over its lesser creatures. When Tyranid forces adapted by developing thicker carapaces and longer-range bioweapons, Ghazghkull's mechboys responded with corresponding enhancements to Ork artillery and armor penetration capabilities. This tactical flexibility surprised not just the Tyranids but Imperial observers as well. Magos Biologis Heron Serpents, monitoring the conflict from a clandestine observation post, noted in his reports that the Greenskin forces display unprecedented adaptive capabilities, suggesting either a fundamental evolution in Ork cognitive processes or the influence of an outlier specimen with exceptional strategic acumen. As his methods proved successful on Octaria IV, Ghazghkull expanded his influence throughout the sector. Rather than conquering Ork-held worlds by force, he dispatched emissaries to their ruling warlords. These representatives, typically veteran knobs who had witnessed the effectiveness of his tactics firsthand, carried a simple message: join Ghazghkull's Waaagh and learn to fight smarter, or face the Tyranids alone. Many warlords initially rejected these overtures, viewing them as signs of weakness. Those who did were left to their fate, with Ghazghkull's forces making no move to assist when Tyranid splinter fleets descended upon their worlds. The inevitable defeat served as object lessons for other Ork leaders, who increasingly saw the benefits of Ghazghkull's protection. Within 6 months, nearly 40% of the Ork-held worlds in the Octaria sector had pledged allegiance to the prophet of Gork and Mork. This consolidation of power allowed Ghazghkull to implement broader strategic initiatives. On worlds under his control, he established standardized defense systems that emphasized depth, redundancy, and overlapping fields of fire. Mech workshops were reorganized to focus on mass production of effective weapons rather than the typical Orkish preference for unique, customized designs. Training grounds were established where Orks could practice coordinated maneuvers and specialized tactics against simulated Tyranid assaults. The most significant development came when Ghazghkull turned his attention to the Tyranid fleet dynamics. Through careful observation of hive fleet movements, his mechboys identified patterns in how Tyranid organisms transferred biomass between worlds. Under his direction, specialized void vessels were constructed with the sole purpose of intercepting these transfers. By disrupting the Tyranid's resource cycle, these operations slowed the rate at which the hive fleet could replace its losses and adapt to Ork countermeasures. This comprehensive approach transformed what had been a gradually losing battle against the Tyranids into something approaching a stalemate. While the hive mind's adaptability and virtually limitless numbers prevented any decisive Ork victory, Ghazghkull's methods ensured that the Greenskins could maintain their territorial holdings without the catastrophic losses they had previously sustained. The strategic implications of this achievement extended far beyond the immediate conflict. By stabilizing the Ork position in the Octaria sector, Ghazghkull created something unprecedented: a sustainable Ork empire that could project power consistently rather than burning brightly before collapsing. The Waaagh energy generated by millions of Orks engaged in continuous warfare strengthened his psychic connection to Gork and Mork, enhancing his prophetic abilities and allowing him to coordinate activities across dozens of star systems simultaneously. This expansion of influence inevitably brought Ghazghkull into contact with other Xenos species besides the Tyranids. His first significant encounter with Necron forces occurred on the desert world of Thanatar, a seemingly insignificant planet on the edge of the Octaria sector. Ork mining operations, established to extract resources for Ghazghkull's war effort, inadvertently activated a dormant Necron tomb complex beneath the planet's northern polar region. The Necron response was immediate and devastating. Phalanxes of warriors emerged from below ground, their Gauss weapons reducing Ork miners to component atoms within hours of first contact. A conventional Ork warlord might have committed increasingly large forces to a war of attrition against this new threat, but Ghazghkull's approach demonstrated his growing strategic sophistication. After a brief probing attack confirmed the Necrons' technological superiority in direct confrontation, Ghazghkull ordered a complete withdrawal from Thanatar. Rather than abandoning the planet entirely, however, he established a quarantine perimeter in orbit. Fast attack craft maintained constant surveillance of the surface while avoiding direct engagement with Necron forces. This containment strategy prevented the Necrons from expanding beyond Thanatar while minimizing Ork losses. More telling was Ghazghkull's response to the intelligence gathered during this encounter. Recognizing the unique threat posed by Necron technology, he established dedicated research enclaves on several worlds where mechboys could study captured Necron artifacts and develop countermeasures. These facilities operated under strict protocols that prevented the spread of Necron technoviruses into the broader Ork infrastructure, demonstrating an understanding of contamination risks unusual for greenskin leadership. The encounter with Eldar forces proved even more complex. A Craftworld Biel-Tan expeditionary force, operating in the Octaria sector to contain potential Tyranid expansion vectors, found themselves observing Ghazghkull's operations with increasing concern. Eldar Farseers, peering into possible futures, detected patterns suggesting that Ghazghkull's unification of Ork forces might represent a greater long-term threat than even the Tyranid hive fleets. Initial Eldar attacks targeted Ork supply convoys and outlying bases, using hit-and-run tactics to avoid direct confrontation with major greenskin concentrations. These operations followed established Eldar doctrine, aiming to disrupt Ork logistics through precision strikes while minimizing exposure to their overwhelming numbers. What the Eldar failed to anticipate was Ghazghkull's adaptive response to these tactics. Rather than pursuing the elusive Eldar forces as most Ork warlords would have done, Ghazghkull implemented a counter-ambush strategy. Supply convoys were redesigned to include hidden compartments carrying specialized commando units trained to track Eldar movement patterns. When the Xenos raiders struck what appeared to be vulnerable targets, they found themselves caught between the convoys, defensive forces, and commando teams emerging from concealed positions. The effectiveness of this approach forced the Eldar to reconsider their strategy. Farseer Idrenal, commanding the Biel-Tan forces, recognized that conventional military operations would be insufficient against an Ork leader capable of anticipating and countering Eldar tactics. In a move that reflected the gravity with which the Eldar viewed the threat, Idrenal initiated diplomatic contact, something almost unprecedented in Eldar-Ork relations. The meeting between Ghazghkull and Idrenal, conducted on a neutral asteroid at the edge of the Octaria sector, remains one of the most unusual diplomatic encounters in recent galactic history. No transcript exists of their conversation, but subsequent events suggested an arrangement of mutual non-interference. Eldar forces withdrew from Ghazghkull's primary supply routes, while Ork expansions avoided several star systems of apparent significance to Craftworld Biel-Tan. This pragmatic approach to interspecies relations represented a fundamental departure from traditional Orkish behavior. While Ghazghkull never abandoned the core Ork belief in their species' ultimate destiny to dominate the galaxy, he demonstrated a willingness to delay gratification and make tactical accommodations when they served his broader strategic vision. This capacity for nuanced decision-making distinguished him from virtually all other Ork warlords in recorded history. The formation of the Great Rift in the early 42nd millennium created new challenges and opportunities for Ghazghkull's expanding empire. The massive warp tier that split the galaxy introduced unprecedented warp storm activity throughout the Octarius sector, disrupting communication and transportation networks for all species involved in the conflict. Imperial analysts expected this development to fragment the Ork forces, as isolated warlords typically revert to localized conflicts when cut off from central leadership. Instead, Ghazghkull demonstrated remarkable adaptability to these new conditions. Having anticipated potential communication difficulties, he had already established a network of Weirdboy relay stations on key worlds throughout his territory. These psychic transmitters, staffed by Orks with unusually stable manifestations of psychic ability, could maintain connections even through moderate warp disturbances. While not as reliable as direct control, this system allowed Ghazghkull to maintain strategic coherence across his domain despite the deteriorating warp conditions. More significantly, Ghazghkull recognized the opportunity presented by the galaxy-wide chaos following the Great Rift's formation. Imperial forces, stretched thin responding to countless emergencies, could no longer maintain even their limited monitoring of the Octarius sector. This reduced oversight allowed Ghazghkull to expand his influence into neighboring regions with minimal resistance from human defenders. The world of Krato 6 exemplified this opportunistic expansion. An Imperial hive world of moderate strategic importance, Krato had maintained a sizable defense force and orbital monitoring stations that would normally detect and repel small-scale Ork incursions. Following the Great Rift's appearance, these defenses were compromised by equipment failures, warp-induced madness among key personnel, and the reassignment of military assets to more pressing threats elsewhere. When Ghazghkull's forces arrived in the system, they encountered only token resistance. Rather than the typical Ork approach of immediate, overwhelming assault, Ghazghkull implemented a staged invasion that preserved much of the planet's industrial capacity. Manufactorum districts were captured intact, their human workers enslaved rather than slaughtered. Within months, these facilities had been converted to produce war material for Ghazghkull's expanding fleet, their output exceeding that of many dedicated Ork mech shops due to the precision of human manufacturing techniques. This pattern repeated across multiple sectors adjacent to Ghazghkull's core territory. Worlds with valuable resources or strategic positions found themselves targeted by precision raids that crippled defenses while preserving infrastructure. Those without significant value faced devastating attacks designed to generate refugee crises that would strain Imperial resources elsewhere. In both cases, the operations displayed a level of strategic calculation that confounded Imperial commanders accustomed to more straightforward Ork aggression. As his domain expanded, Ghazghkull's personal legend grew proportionally. Among Orks across the galaxy, stories spread of the prophet who spoke directly with Gork and Mork, whose tactical genius had stymied even the Tyrannid hive mind, and whose physical might had grown to match his strategic acumen. These tales, carried by freebooter vessels and transmitted through the psychic emanations of excited weirdboys, inspired countless warlords to adopt elements of Ghazghkull's methods. Even Orks who had never directly encountered Ghazghkull's forces began organizing their warbands into more cohesive structures, implementing basic combined arms tactics, and developing rudimentary strategic objectives beyond immediate violence. This diffusion of tactical sophistication throughout Ork society represented perhaps Ghazghkull's most significant long-term impact on the galaxy, elevating the baseline threat level of all Ork forces through the power of his example. Among Imperial populations, Ghazghkull's legend took a darker form. Planetary governors used his name to frighten their populations into compliance with increased security measures. Commissars invoked the threat of his Waaagh to motivate wavering guard regiments. Inquisitorial propaganda portrayed him as the green face of Xenos' annihilation, a primal force of destruction in physical form. This fearsome reputation served Ghazghkull's purposes, enhancing the psychological impact of his operations and ensuring that Imperial commanders responded to even minor Ork incursions with disproportionate force. By becoming the embodiment of the Ork threat in the Imperial imagination, Ghazghkull achieved a strategic multiplier effect, where actions taken by any Ork force were potentially attributed to his influence, creating the perception of a coordinated greenskin offensive spanning multiple sectors. The reality, as always with Ghazghkull, proved more complex than either Ork mythology or Imperial propaganda suggested. While his strategic vision extended across vast distances and encompassed multiple simultaneous campaigns, even Ghazghkull could not directly control all the forces that operated under his banner. Many warlords who claimed allegiance to his Waaagh acted with considerable autonomy, implementing their own interpretations of his tactical doctrines with varying degrees of success. Ghazghkull appeared to accept this arrangement as an inevitable consequence of Ork psychology and the practical limitations of command across interstellar distances. Rather than attempting to impose rigid control, he focused on establishing broad strategic parameters and core tactical principles, allowing his subordinates to adapt these guidelines to local conditions. This approach maximized the natural Orkish talent for improvisation while maintaining sufficient coherence to advance his overall objectives. The ash wastes of Ulanur Prime stretched endlessly under the blood-red sky as Ghazghkull's personal convoy rumbled across the barren landscape. The massive battle wagon, reinforced with additional armor plating and decorated with the skulls of fallen enemies, kicked up clouds of dust that could be seen for kilometers. Flanked by a dozen smaller vehicles carrying his most trusted nobs, the prophet of Gork and Mork traveled to what he believed would be a diplomatic gathering with potential allies in his ever-expanding Waaagh. Intelligence had reached Ghazghkull about two powerful warlords operating in this sector who had expressed interest in joining his crusade. The Blood Axe warlord Snagrod, known as the Arch-Arsonist of Cheradin, had built a reputation for unusual cunning even by the standards of his clan. The Deathskull's warlord Orkish controlled vast salvage operations that could provide valuable resources for Ghazghkull's war machine. Both had requested this meeting, ostensibly to negotiate the terms of their allegiance. What Ghazghkull didn't know was that the meeting was a carefully orchestrated trap. Snagrod and Orkish had no intention of submitting to another warlord, no matter how legendary. They had grown increasingly concerned about Ghazghkull's rising influence among Ork societies across the galaxy. His methods were spreading, elevating lesser warbosses, who adopted his tactics to positions of power they would never have achieved otherwise. For ambitious warlords like Snagrod and Orkish, Ghazghkull represented not an opportunity, but an existential threat to their own aspirations. The ambush was sprung as Ghazghkull's convoy entered a narrow canyon. Explosive charges buried in the canyon walls detonated simultaneously, triggering massive rock slides that crushed the escort vehicles. Before the dust had settled, hundreds of Orks emerged from concealed positions on the ridgelines, pouring fire down on the trapped convoy. The carefully planned attack showed none of the typical Orkish disorganization, a testament to the unusual discipline Snagrod had instilled in his forces. Ghazghkull's response was immediate and devastating. Bursting from the damaged battle wagon, he charged directly up the canyon wall toward the heaviest concentration of attackers, his power claw slicing through rock and flesh with equal ease. Nobs who had survived the initial ambush followed their warlord, forming a wedge of green muscle and metal that drove into the heart of Snagrod's forces. For several minutes, it seemed the ambush might fail despite its careful planning. Ghazghkull's sheer combat prowess, enhanced by decades of augmentation and the Waaagh energy flowing through his massive frame, allowed him to carve through dozens of attackers. Orks who had participated in ambushes against Space Marine convoys reported that not even the Emperor's finest killed with such efficient brutality. The tide turned when Orkish himself entered the fray, bringing with him a cadre of heavily augmented meganobs. While individually none could match Ghazghkull, their coordinated attack forced him to divide his attention. A well-placed shot from a modified custom Mega Blasta overloaded a section of Ghazghkull's armor, creating a vulnerability that Snagrod immediately exploited. The Blood Axe warlord drove a power axe into the gap, severing hydraulic lines and damaging the internal mechanisms that enhanced Ghazghkull's already formidable strength. Despite this injury, Ghazghkull continued fighting with undiminished ferocity. Accounts from survivors suggest he killed both Orkimungus's second-in-command and Snagrod's banner-bearer before a concentrated barrage of fire from a dozen heavy weapons finally brought him to his knees. Even then, he continued to fight, his power claw sweeping in wide arcs that forced his attackers to maintain their distance. The end came not from overwhelming firepower, but from treachery within Ghazghkull's own retinue. A nob named Ghazghkull, who had secretly been promised leadership of his own Waaagh by Snagrod, struck from behind with a power weapon that penetrated the base of Ghazghkull's skull, bypassing the metal plate that had protected his brain for so many decades. The massive warlord collapsed, his nervous system temporarily paralyzed by the precision of the blow. What followed was a scene of calculated brutality, unusual even by Orkish standards. Rather than simply killing their fallen enemy, Snagrod and Orkimungus decided to make an example that would resonate throughout Ork society. With Ghazghkull immobilized but conscious, Snagrod used a ceremonial axe to slowly sever the prophet's head from his body. The process took nearly 10 minutes, with Snagrod deliberately prolonging the execution to maximize its ritual significance. When the deed was finally done, Snagrod held the severed head aloft for all to see. The metal plate that had been the source of Ghazghkull's prophetic connection to Gork and Mork gleamed dully in the red sunlight. Blood dripped from the ragged neck, forming a pool at Snagrod's feet. The message was clear: the legendary prophet of Gork and Mork was no more, and a new era of Orkish leadership had begun. The victorious warlords departed with their prize, leaving Ghazghkull's headless body and the remains of his retinue to be scavenged by the carrion creatures of Ulanar. They broadcast news of their triumph across Ork communication channels, ensuring that word of Ghazghkull's fall would spread quickly throughout the sectors he had influenced. Snagrod in particular took to displaying the severed head during meetings with other warlords, using it as both trophy and warning to any who might consider challenging his ascendant position. What neither Snagrod nor Orkimungus realized was that death, particularly for an Ork of Ghazghkull's unique nature, was not necessarily the end. Among the few survivors of Ghazghkull's retinue was his most loyal lieutenant, a grot named Maikari. This diminutive creature had served as Ghazghkull's standard-bearer for decades, somehow surviving countless battles where larger, stronger Orks had fallen. When the ambushers departed, Maikari emerged from the wreckage where he had hidden and began the seemingly impossible task of recovering his master. Maikari's first action was to secure Ghazghkull's headless body, dragging it inch by inch into a concealed cave system nearby. The grot understood, with a clarity that surprised even himself, that the body must be preserved if there was any hope of recovery. Orkish physiology was remarkably resilient, capable of surviving injuries that would instantly kill members of other species. Even decapitation was not necessarily fatal if proper measures were taken quickly enough. The next step required assistance beyond Maikari's capabilities. Using a portable Vox unit salvaged from the convoy wreckage, he broadcast an encrypted signal on a frequency known only to Ghazghkull's inner circle. The message was simple: "De boss needs his doc. Come quick, bring de best bits." Mad Doc Grotznik received this transmission while overseeing a complex cybernetic implantation procedure on a deaf Dread pilot several systems away. The Painboy had been with Ghazghkull since the beginning, had installed the original metal plate in his skull, and had performed countless augmentations over the decades. If anyone could address a problem as severe as decapitation, it was Grotznik, though even he would consider it a challenging case. Abandoning his current patient mid-surgery, Grotznik gathered his most advanced equipment and his team of assistant grots. Within hours, his personal shuttle was en route to the coordinates Maikari had transmitted. The journey took 3 days, during which Grotznik reviewed everything he knew about Ork neural function and the specific modifications he had made to Ghazghkull's nervous system over the years. Upon arrival, Grotznik found Maikari diligently maintaining Ghazghkull's body in a remarkable state of preservation. The grot had connected crude fluid pumps to the major blood vessels in the neck, keeping a minimal circulation going through the massive frame. He had also applied stimulating electrodes to key muscle groups, preventing atrophy and maintaining tissue viability. Grotznik was impressed. Maikari had essentially created a life support system from battlefield salvage. Where's is Eid? was Grotznik's first question. Maikari explained the situation. Snagrod had taken it as a trophy and was currently displaying it at his headquarters on a nearby moon. The Painboy nodded thoughtfully, his augmetic eye whirring as it focused on the clean cut at Ghazghkull's neck. "We's gonna need dat eed," he declared. "But first, let's make sure dis body stays ready." Grotznik set to work immediately, replacing Maikari's improvised life support with more sophisticated equipment from his own supplies. He installed temporary neural interfaces at key junctions in the spinal cord, maintaining basic autonomic functions and preventing cellular death in critical organs. With the body stabilized, he turned to the more challenging problem, recovering the head. The operation to retrieve Ghazghkull's severed head was conducted with unusual stealth and precision for an Orkish mission. Grotznik selected a small team of his most reliable assistant Grotz, creatures whose small size and natural sneakiness made them ideal for infiltration. Maikari insisted on leading the team personally, his knowledge of Ghazghkull's security protocols proving invaluable in bypassing the defenses Snagrod had established around his grisly trophy. The extraction itself was remarkably successful. Snagrod, confident in his victory and the intimidating effect of displaying Ghazghkull's head, had become complacent about its security. The team of Grotz infiltrated his headquarters during a large celebration, when most of the Blood Axe warriors were deep in their cups. They replaced the actual head with a convincing replica Grotznik had prepared, ensuring that Snagrod would not immediately realize his trophy had been stolen. With both body and head recovered, the real work began. Grotznik established a hidden laboratory in the cave system, bringing in additional equipment with each supply run. The procedure he envisioned went far beyond simply reattaching a severed head. It would require a fundamental reimagining of how Orkish biology could be integrated with mechanical systems. The first challenge was addressing the brain tissue damage that had occurred during the time the head was separated from its life-sustaining body. While Ork brains were remarkably resilient, even they had limits. Significant portions of Ghazghkull's brain had begun to deteriorate, particularly in regions controlling higher cognitive functions. Grotznik addressed this by cultivating replacement tissue from samples he had previously preserved during earlier procedures on his favorite patient. The second and more complex problem was re-establishing the connection between brain and body. The clean cut that had severed Ghazghkull's head had sliced through the spinal cord, destroying the primary pathway for neural signals. Grotznik's solution was characteristically innovative. He constructed an artificial neural interface that would bypass the damaged sections entirely, creating new pathways for brain-body communication. This interface represented the pinnacle of Grotznik's medical expertise, combining salvaged Imperial technology with unique Orkish bioengineering. Microscopic filaments of neural conductive material were painstakingly inserted into both the brainstem and the severed spinal cord, creating thousands of connection points that could transmit signals across the gap. A ring of specialized processors, installed around the neck like a collar, translated these signals and amplified them to ensure clear transmission. The most crucial component of the reconstruction was the enhancement of Ghazghkull's original metal skull plate. Grotznik had long suspected that this crude implant, installed decades earlier after a battlefield head wound, had somehow catalyzed Ghazghkull's connection to the Waaagh energy and his prophetic visions from Gork and Mork. For the resurrection to be complete, this connection needed to be not just restored but strengthened. Grotznik expanded the plate into a full cranial casing, integrating it with the neural interface system and adding receptors specifically designed to detect and amplify psychic energy. The material itself was upgraded, incorporating fragments of mysterious artifacts Grotznik had collected during his travels with Ghazghkull's Waaagh. Some of these components came from Xenos technology of unknown origin, their properties not fully understood even by the Painboy himself. The actual reattachment procedure took nearly 3 weeks, with Grotznik working continuously, pausing only when fatigue threatened the precision of his work. Maikari remained present throughout, assisting where possible and providing a continuous narrative of Ghazghkull's greatest victories, a form of psychological stimulus that Grotznik believed might help re-establish neural pathways associated with the warlord's identity and memories. On the 23rd day, the final connections were made. Grotznik stepped back from his work, his surgical tools still dripping with various fluids, and observed the results. Ghazghkull's massive form lay still on the reinforced table, head now reattached to body with a visible seam of metal and organic connective tissue circling his neck. The cranial casing gleamed with subtle energy patterns, pulsing occasionally as power fluctuated through its mysterious components. "Now we waits," Grotznik told Maikari. "Either the boss comes back or he don't. Ain't nothing more I can do." For 3 days, there was no sign of life beyond the basic mechanical functions maintained by Grotznik's machinery. The body's organs continued to function, and occasional muscle twitches suggested some neural activity, but the spark of consciousness, the essential quality that had made Ghazghkull who he was, remained absent. On the 4th day, as Grotznik was considering more radical interventions, a change occurred. The energy patterns in the cranial casing intensified, pulsing with increasing frequency. Monitoring equipment detected a surge in electrical activity throughout the neural network, starting in the brain and cascading down through the artificial interface into the body. Muscle groups began contracting in coordinated patterns rather than random twitches. Then, with a suddenness that startled even Grotznik, Ghazghkull's eyes opened. The red glow that had always characterized his gaze was now brighter, more intense, with subtle patterns moving within the illumination like data streams in a cogitator display. His massive hand, the one not replaced by his iconic power claw, rose slowly to touch the metal seam at his neck, fingers tracing the line where death had been undone. When Ghazghkull finally spoke, his voice was deeper than before, with harmonic undertones that seemed to resonate from the metal components of his reconstructed form. "I've seen dem," he said simply. "While I was dead, I've seen Gork and Mork, clearer than ever." The implications of this statement sent a shiver through even Grotznik's madness-addled mind. The idea that Ghazghkull's consciousness had somehow communed with the Ork gods while separated from his body suggested possibilities beyond conventional Orkish theology. Had his prophetic connection actually allowed his mind to transcend physical death? Or had the trauma of decapitation triggered a new kind of vision, more intense than those he had experienced previously? Whatever the truth, the effect on Ghazghkull was profound. As he regained strength over the following days, he spoke at length about the revelations he had received during his death time. The visions described a destiny for the Ork race that extended beyond simple conquest, a cosmic role as the ultimate warriors in a universe increasingly dominated by forces of disorder and decay. Gork and Mork had shown him that the Orks were not just meant to fight, but to be the final bulwark against enemies that threatened the very nature of existence itself. These theological concepts were unprecedented in Ork culture, which typically focused on immediate martial glory rather than cosmic purpose. Yet Ghazghkull articulated them with a clarity and conviction that resonated even with the limited intellects of Grotznik's assistant Grotz. There was something in his words that connected with a deeper current in the Orkish psyche, a primal understanding of their species' purpose that transcended conscious thought. Physically, the resurrected Ghazghkull was changed in ways beyond the visible modifications. His strength, already legendary, had increased to levels that seemed impossible even for his massive frame. During his recovery, he accidentally shattered a solid adamantium support beam with a casual gesture of frustration. His reflexes had similarly improved, with response times that Grotznik's instruments struggled to measure accurately. Most significantly, his connection to the Waaagh energy field had intensified dramatically. Orkish psychic phenomena had always manifested more strongly in Ghazghkull's presence, but now they reached new levels of potency. Weapons in his vicinity fired with increased power and reliability. Vehicles moved faster and with greater maneuverability. Wounds on nearby Orks healed with visible speed. The effect was so pronounced that Grotznik began documenting it as a new category of Waaagh manifestation, distinct from previously observed patterns. As news of Ghazghkull's resurrection spread, its impact on Ork society proved as significant as his original prophetic awakening. The fact that he had returned from death, an experience no other known Ork had survived, transformed him from merely a favored prophet of Gork and Mork to something approaching a physical manifestation of their will. Warlords who had been quick to pledge allegiance to Snagrod after news of Ghazghkull's death now reversed course, sending emissaries to reaffirm their loyalty to the resurrected prophet. For Snagrod and Orkimungus, the consequences were immediate and devastating. When they discovered the deception, that they had been proudly displaying a replica of Ghazghkull's head, their positions among their own followers became untenable. Orks who had witnessed Ghazghkull's resurrection firsthand spread accounts that grew more miraculous with each telling, describing how he had manifested in a burst of green energy that vaporized his enemies. While far from the truth, these stories created an aura of supernatural power around Ghazghkull that few Orks were willing to challenge. The resurrected Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka emerged from Grotznik's hidden laboratory as something transcending ordinary Orkish existence. The metal seam encircling his neck, the visible reminder of his death and rebirth, became not a mark of weakness, but a symbol of his anointed status. Many Orks who beheld him after his resurrection claimed the seam sometimes glowed with a greenish light when he spoke of Gork and Mork's plans for the greenskin race. By the early years of the 42nd millennium, Ghazghkull had consolidated his position as the supreme prophet and greatest warlord of the Ork race. His Waaagh stretched across multiple sectors, incorporating hundreds of worlds and billions of greenskins. Unlike previous Ork empires that typically collapsed after a generation due to infighting and lack of direction, Ghazghkull's domain showed remarkable stability. The organizational structures he had implemented, his council of warbosses, standardized production methods, and strategic doctrine, created a framework that channeled the natural Orkish aggression towards sustainable expansion rather than self-destruction. Imperial analysts observed this development with growing alarm. Inquisitor Veritas of the Ordo Xenos authored a classified assessment that circulated among the highest levels of Imperial leadership, stating, "What we are witnessing is not merely another Ork uprising, but an evolutionary leap in greenskin social organization. Ghazghkull has created something previously thought impossible, an Ork empire capable of learning from its mistakes and adapting to opposition." If this pattern continues, we may be facing a threat comparable to the beast of the 32nd millennium, but with the benefit of strategic patience that the original beast lacked. This assessment proved prescient, as Ghazghkull's forces demonstrated increasing sophistication in their operations. Rather than launching haphazard attacks against whatever targets presented themselves, the Waaagh followed a discernible strategic pattern. Worlds with significant manufacturing capacity were captured with minimal damage to infrastructure. Planets rich in specific resources needed for Ork war production were systematically stripped. Populations useful for slave labor were subjugated rather than exterminated. Each conquest fed into the next, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of expansion. Most concerning to Imperial strategists was Ghazghkull's apparent grand strategy. After his resurrection, the prophet of Gork and Mork spoke increasingly of a final Waaagh, a culminating conflict that would establish Ork dominance over all other species. Unlike the vague apocalyptic visions common in Ork culture, Ghazghkull described this future war with unusual specificity. He spoke of gathering the entire Ork race under a single banner, of weapons that could crack planets, and of battles that would reshape the galaxy itself. These prophecies gained credibility as elements of Ghazghkull's predictions manifested in reality. He had foretold the formation of the Great Rift years before it appeared, describing it as "de sky splittin', open to let de gods watch better." He had predicted the awakening of the Necrons in specific sectors months before Imperial forces encountered them. Most impressively, he had warned his followers about the expansion of Tyranid Hive Fleet Leviathan along corridors that astropathic prognosticators only identified much later. The accuracy of these predictions enhanced Ghazghkull's authority among Orks across the galaxy. Warlords who had never personally encountered him began adopting his tactical doctrines and organizational methods. The distinctive black and white checkered pattern of his Goth clan appeared as honor markings on vehicles and armor of Orks from completely different clans. His name was invoked in pre-battle rituals by greenskins fighting in theaters thousands of light years from his personal campaigns. This galaxy-wide influence allowed Ghazghkull to implement the next phase of his vision, the unification of previously independent Waaghs into a coordinated force. Rather than directly conquering rival Ork empires, he dispatched emissaries to their leaders. These representatives, typically veteran nobs who had witnessed his resurrection or experienced his tactical successes firsthand, carried a simple message: join the Great Waaagh voluntarily or face Ghazghkull's attention once he had finished with weaker enemies. Many warlords accepted these terms, recognizing both the practical benefits of alignment with Ghazghkull's growing power and the religious significance of joining the Prophet's crusade. Those who refused often found their own followers increasingly questioning their leadership, with ambitious subordinates citing Ghazghkull's teachings to justify challenges to authority. This process created a selection pressure that gradually aligned the broader Ork society with Ghazghkull's strategic vision, even without his direct intervention. The technological development within Ghazghkull's domain accelerated dramatically following his resurrection. The enhanced connection to Waaagh energy that Grotznik's procedures had established seemed to manifest particularly strongly in mechanical applications. Mechboys working in proximity to Ghazghkull reported unprecedented success rates with experimental devices. Weapons achieved reliability that defied the typical haphazard nature of Ork technology. Vehicles performed beyond their theoretical capabilities when deployed under his direct command. This technological evolution produced innovations that concerned even the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Gorkanaut and Morkanaut war machines, massive bipedal combat walkers that combined elements of Imperial Knight technology with uniquely Orkish design principles, represented a significant advance in greenskin heavy armor capabilities. The shock attack gun, which used warp-based technology to teleport grots directly into enemy war machines or fortifications, demonstrated an intuitive understanding of principles that Mechanicus adepts spent decades studying. Most alarming was the development of what Imperial forces designated the Rock Fleet, a system of asteroid bases modified with propulsion systems and void shields that could be deployed as mobile fortresses. These massive structures combine the defensive resilience of planetoids with offensive capabilities exceeding many Imperial capital ships. Their ability to establish immediate forward bases during planetary invasions transformed the strategic calculus of void warfare, allowing Ghazghkull's forces to bypass traditional staging requirements. The psychological dimension of Ghazghkull's Waaagh proved equally sophisticated. Traditional Ork warfare relied primarily on overwhelming force and terror tactics based on physical intimidation. Ghazghkull's approach incorporated targeted propaganda, strategic deception, and psychological profiling of enemy leadership. During the campaign against the Serenade system, his forces broadcast manipulated picked captures showing Imperial officers abandoning civilian populations, triggering riots that disabled planetary defense coordination before the main Ork landings even began. This multifaceted approach to warfare reflected Ghazghkull's unique understanding of conflict as more than simply a clash of military forces. He recognized that victory required domination across multiple domains: physical, technological, psychological, and even spiritual. His strategies integrated these elements into comprehensive campaigns that targeted enemy weaknesses at all levels simultaneously, creating cascading failures that conventional defense doctrine struggled to address. The Imperium's response to this evolving threat followed predictable patterns initially. Military assets were reallocated to threatened sectors. Defensive perimeters were established around high-value systems. Propaganda efforts emphasized isolated Imperial victories while downplaying the strategic coherence of Ghazghkull's operations. These conventional countermeasures proved increasingly inadequate as the Waaagh adapted to each response, probing for weaknesses and exploiting hesitation or overcommitment with equal opportunism. As the threat assessment escalated, more radical approaches gained consideration among Imperial leadership. The Inquisition's Ordo Xenos established specialized task forces dedicated solely to tracking Ghazghkull's movements and identifying potential vulnerabilities in his command structure. The Officio Assassinorum authorized unprecedented resources for elimination attempts, though all such efforts failed due to the layers of protection surrounding the Ork prophet and his uncanny ability to anticipate such attacks. The most extreme contingency plans involved the deployment of exterminatus-level weapons against worlds under Ghazghkull's direct control, regardless of any remaining human populations. These proposals generated significant controversy within Imperial leadership, with pragmatists arguing that such actions would only delay rather than prevent the Waagh's expansion, while sacrificing resources that could not be replaced. The debate remained unresolved, as more immediate crises demanded attention following the formation of the Great Rift. Commissar Yarrick remained the Imperium's most effective counter to Ghazghkull's influence, though age and accumulated injuries had limited his direct combat role. The elderly Commissar transitioned to an advisory position, training specialized units in anti-Ork warfare based on his decades of experience fighting Ghazghkull's forces. His insights proved invaluable in developing countermeasures to the evolving Ork tactics, though even Yarrick admitted that the resurrected Ghazghkull represented a threat beyond anything he had previously encountered. The personal nemesis relationship between Yarrick and Ghazghkull continued to fascinate observers on both sides of the conflict. Ork forces under Ghazghkull's command maintained standing orders to capture rather than kill the elderly Commissar if encountered. Imperial intelligence intercepted communications suggesting that Ghazghkull intended to preserve Yarrick as a worthy opponent for the final Waaagh, a gesture of respect virtually unprecedented in Ork culture. For his part, Yarrick spoke of Ghazghkull with a complex mixture of hatred and professional admiration, acknowledging the Ork warlord's strategic genius while remaining committed to his eventual destruction. As the 42nd millennium progressed, prophetic elements began appearing more frequently in Ghazghkull's communications with his followers. He spoke of decoming darkness, a period when the entire galaxy would face existential threats from multiple directions simultaneously. In these visions, the Orks emerged as the only species with the numbers, resilience, and martial capability to withstand these challenges. Ghazghkull positioned his Waaagh not merely as a conquering force, but as the necessary foundation for this future role, building the strength and organization the greenskin race would need to survive the coming cataclysm. These prophecies aligned disturbingly well with prognostications from other sources. Eldar Farseers had long warned of convergent catastrophes in the near future. The Emperor's Tarot showed patterns of unprecedented clarity, indicating multiple extinction-level threats emerging simultaneously. Even the chaotic visions of unsanctioned human psychers included recurring elements that paralleled Ghazghkull's predictions, suggesting that he was perceiving genuine patterns in the warp rather than simply manufacturing religious authority. The possibility that Ghazghkull's prophetic abilities represented a genuine connection to future events raised profound questions about the nature of the Ork gods and their relationship to the broader metaphysical structure of the universe. If Gork and Mork were providing accurate foreknowledge to their chosen prophet, it implied a level of cosmic awareness previously attributed only to the most powerful warp entities. This theological dimension added another layer of complexity to the already formidable threat Ghazghkull represented. By the mid-42nd millennium, Imperial strategic assessments classified the Ghazghkull-led Waaagh as one of the top 5 existential threats facing humanity, alongside the Tyranid Hive fleets, Chaos forces emerging from the Great Rift, the awakening Necron dynasties, and the expanding Tiao Empire. Unlike these other threats, however, Ghazghkull's forces demonstrated an unusual pattern of restraint in certain operations, suggesting a longer-term strategic vision than the Imperium had previously attributed to any Ork leader. This restraint manifested most clearly in the treatment of certain captured worlds. Planets with specific resources or strategic positions received garrison forces that maintained order rather than the typical Orkish pattern of exploitation until exhaustion. Human populations on these worlds were subjected to labor requirements and resource extraction, but were not exterminated or subjected to the random violence characteristic of most Ork occupations. Infrastructure was maintained and sometimes even expanded, albeit repurposed for Ork use. The pattern suggested that Ghazghkull was building not just a military force, but a sustainable empire capable of projecting power over extended periods. This approach, unprecedented in recorded Ork history, aligned with his prophetic statements about preparing for a future conflict of cosmic significance. If the final Waaagh he described was indeed coming, it would require resources and organization beyond anything the greenskin race had previously achieved. As the Great Waaagh continued its expansion, patterns emerged in its conquests that revealed Ghazghkull's broader strategic vision. Systems with access to specific rare materials received priority attention. Worlds with ancient ruins or Xenos artifacts were subjected to unusual scrutiny by specialized Ork units. Certain spatial coordinates, apparently significant in Ghazghkull's prophetic understanding, but meaningless by conventional strategic assessment, became focal points for massive resource investment. These patterns, when analyzed by the Ordo Xenos, suggested that Ghazghkull was preparing for a specific future conflict, rather than simply expanding opportunistically. The preparations included gathering materials for weapons of unprecedented scale, establishing defenses against specific types of attacks, and positioning forces along corridors that had no current strategic value, but might become significant if certain warp disturbances continued their observed patterns of expansion. The implications of this analysis disturbed even veteran inquisitors. If Ghazghkull's preparations were indeed based on accurate foreknowledge, then the threat he anticipated must be of sufficient magnitude to concern even an Ork prophet of his stature. The possibility that the Imperium might eventually face a choice between Ghazghkull's Waaagh and some greater unknown horror represented a strategic nightmare scenario with no satisfactory resolution. As the 42nd millennium continues to unfold, Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka stands as the most significant Ork leader since the beast himself. His unprecedented combination of strategic genius, prophetic vision, and organizational capability has transformed the greenskin race from a persistent nuisance into a civilization-level threat. Whether his final Waaagh will manifest as he has foreseen, and what role it might play in the galaxy's increasingly apocalyptic future, remains to be seen. What is certain is that any calculation of humanity's prospects for survival must now account for the Green Prophet who died and returned with a vision that continues to reshape the galaxy with each passing year. The destiny of Ghazghkull Thraka and his Great Waaagh remains inextricably linked with the fate of the galaxy itself. As new threats emerge and ancient powers reawaken, the prophet of Gork and Mork continues his preparations for the final conflict he has foreseen. Whether as humanity's destroyer, or, in the most unexpected twist of cosmic irony, its unwitting savior against even greater threats, Ghazghkull's impact on the 42nd millennium has only begun to manifest. The green tide rises, guided by a vision that extends beyond the comprehension of other species, toward a future where only the strongest will survive, and in the brutal calculus of Orkish philosophy, there can be no question who the strongest must be.